Welcome back. It's been a little bit since I was in the studio here recording our last, would have been Feed the Monster. Really excited to come back again. Going to kick off a series here over the next couple of months or couple of weeks, really kind of highlighting a deep dive into agronomy, but really want to start with kind of where we've been, where we're going, and what the future might hold. So again, welcome back. Thanks for tuning in. Really appreciate it. Some of you that tuned into Feed the Monster last, this might be a little bit redundant for you, but for any of our new viewers, just want to give you a little bit of a background on who we are. In 1989, Biodyne Incorporated was started by Dr. Fred Farley. He's a microbiologist out of Sarasota, Florida. His focus was on environmental biotechnology, the use of microbes for environmental applications. In 1990 to 1999, he was isolating microbes cultivating for environmental applications. Bioremediation such as petroleum hydrocarbons, thinking oil refinery, gas, diesel tanks, industrial oils. Also with a focus on complex organic degradation. So think of your solvents, your chlorinated compounds, your VOCs, pesticides, herbicides, phenols. While also focusing on wastewater treatment, municipality, food service, industrial, septic tanks. In 2000 to 2011, he shifted again, focusing on isolating microbes and cultivating them for their use in agriculture. Hundreds of trials in greenhouse, field-wide on a variety of crops, multiple repetitions. Really started in Colombia in rose production, focusing there on building bigger, better plants that were ready for shipment from Colombia to the US, to the EU, and really what they were focused on was how can they create a healthier plant that lasts through shipping and will make it to the storefront. What they found is that he did that very well. Some might say too well. And what they had was they had too many clippings now from those roses that they couldn't get to degrade, which led to another creation of one of our microbes. In 2012, Biodyne USA was formed in Fort Wayne, Indiana to provide commercial operations. So they scaled up fermentation, production, research, marketing, and sales for those Biodyne technologies. Agriculture, remediation, and wastewater was the focus. That was started by Gil Farley and Tim Weir. In 2013, they were fortunate enough to meet a man named Dan Coffin. He was an agronomist that has been talking about these technologies for multiple years. He got to hear what their technology was and got them the 401 product on 20,000 acres immediately. So here's just a little bit of a map of where we're at today with production facilities in our lab. So as you can see, our microbiology lab and team is down there in Sarasota, Florida. We have fermentation and production capabilities in Tulsa, Oklahoma. We have fermentation and production in Fonda, Iowa. And we also, where our main headquarters is, we have fermentation and production here in Fort Wayne, Indiana. The thing that's unique about Biodyne is that it's 100% controlled in-house, closed loop. Biodyne does not rely on buying anybody's microbes. These are all non-pathogenic, not genetically modified, isolated microbes by Dr. Farley. Well, if this picture doesn't make you jealous right now, I'm sure that wherever you're tuning in, if it's not from Florida, it's probably colder than what this picture would show. This is an overhead view of our microbiology lab in Sarasota, Florida. This is where all of the isolation, the initial isolation occurs of our microbes. Here's a shot of Fort Wayne, Indiana. This is a new facility, relatively new facility, been in about a year and a half. Brand new facility, outgrew the old one, moved in here in the spring of 2020, outgrew that and had to purchase the next available space beside it as well. So Biodyne continues to grow here, not only in the US, but in other countries as well. Here's an inside shot of our lab and our production room. So as you can see there on the left, we have, you've got fermentation. So you've got a couple smaller fermenters there, and then you've got a little bit larger. We've got state-of-the-art water treatment facility. We use Wi-Fi water, which is water for injection. Everything that we do at biodyne is medical grade. So I guess if the biological side doesn't work out, we can always help Pfizer making the next COVID-19 vaccine. You can see there our lab as well. This is where we do a lot of bench level testing. We're testing all of our microbes with certain herbicides, certain insecticides, fungicides. You think of it, we're testing it. Carbon sources. One thing that we have found is that not all carbon sources are created equal. Again, that is something that is very, very big to me. It's a focus that I have made to make sure that these products that our biologicals are getting paired with are beneficial or complementary to our product line. This is a shot of our Biodyne USA Iowa facility out in Fonda. This was operational in November of 2019. As you can see, a little bit bigger reactors. There's 4 reactors here. I should have mentioned that Fort Wayne is about to get a severe upgrade here in the next 30 days with our fermentation capabilities. Biodyne USA has developed an unmatched system of microbes working as a team. We don't focus on single strain biologicals, and the reason is because of this. Finally, the most functional traits of beneficial microbes, the degradation of plant litter, the development of the food web structures, closed nutrient cycles, they're not a result of a single organism, but of a microbial community which closely interact with each other. So as you can see on the screen here, this is showing our teams. Everything we talked about earlier, everything we do is not single organisms, it is a team. We have the 101 team, which is focused on a petroleum hydrocarbon degradation. We have the 201 focused on complex organic degradation. 301 that is focused on fats and polymers. We use that in the manure, animal manure, livestock manure, wastewater treatment facilities. We have the 401 team, which is commonly used in the growth promotion, so plant growth, plant health enhancement. And then we use the 501 team is the cellulose and the chitin, the polymer degradation. Interesting thing about our microbial team technology is there's between 25 and 32 beneficial microorganism strains in each blend. Our viability, we have greater than 500 million microbes per ml, which is about 20 drops of water. So from 2012 to 2020, when Biodyne was first formed, 2012, 2013, we were on 15,000 acres. 2016, 250,000 acres. 2019, 750,000 acres. 2020, over 1 million acres, with a 2021 projection over 2 million acres. It only continues to climb from here. So for those of you that tuned in last time on Feed the Monster, you realized that there was nobody sitting beside me. Today, I'm extremely fortunate to have Sean Nettleton with us. Sean is a CCA. He's got his master's in plant and soil science and joins us from Southern Illinois. Sean has spent time with Bex as a regional agronomist in Southern Illinois. For us, Sean is going to cover Southern Indiana. He's going to cover Illinois, Kentucky, Tennessee. And really, as we continue to grow out, Sean's going to be an asset for any of you. We realize that as we continue to grow, we continue to get into these new states, one person can't cover it all. So thanks to you guys, thanks to you guys using our products, really created by demand, we're extremely happy to have Sean join us today. I gave you a little bit of where we've been. Sean's going to kind of take us and show you where we're going.
Thanks, Bodie. So Bodie did a great job talking about Biodyne and where Biodyne has come from. Let's talk about BW Fusion, because BW Fusion is a partnership between Biodyne and Wells Ag Supply out of Fonda, Iowa. And so there's some tenets of this business. And first off, this is a farmer-focused business. That's something that our principal guys, our founders and our partners talk about a lot. We're focused on making the farmer successful, family-owned and operated. These guys talk about this because this is important to them. We're not backed by venture capital. This is not a business that's looking to build and then sell out for a quick buck here. So Grant Wells, one of our founders from Wells Ag Supply, talks about this a lot. Empowered by freedom and an independent spirit. These guys are entrepreneurs. They want to see farmers be successful, and they want to see this business grow. So what is the BW Fusion difference? So Bodie talked about biodyne. So that's the biology. And so we look at this biology plus fertility plus nutritional products plus Agronomy 365, which is a soil and tissue sampling or tissue testing program that we work with to validate the things that we're seeing in the field. And what that leads to is better farm efficiency and more ROI for our customers. So let's talk about the BW Fusion timeline. So where BW Fusion started, it all started in about 2019. Biodyne and Wells Ag Supply partnered together to form BW Fusion. Where this came from was Wells Ag Supply was actually a Biodyne dealer. Really liked what they were seeing with the products and decided to do that, the biological piece, the nutritional piece, and really see where this could go. So 2020, the first year of sales, $4 million, had 6 employees, so really a small business. What's happening now with the likes of Bodie and the sales guys out in the field? By 2021, so the second year of the company existing, sales of $20+ million, and we've added and have 25+ employees. So where are we going from here? For 22, looking for projected sales of maybe $45+ million. We've got 40+ employees coming, and these guys talk about this a lot. They want to reinvest 100% of that business into the future of making this business a viable business and taking care of our farmer customers. To make that reinvestment, we do things like new facilities. So as you can see here in Iowa at the Fonda location, we've got new buildings going up, new mixing facilities for biology and for our nutritional products. Here in Indiana at the Logansport facility, this is another transportation and blending and mixing hub. Then obviously we've got the Fort Wayne facility that Bodie talked about from Biodyne. That's also a BW Fusion mix and loadout hub. And Bodie even mentioned this. He said investment in facilities. If we're making biology and we're making medical grade, with the way our business is growing, we can see our lab here. And throughout the month of December, you're going to see a huge investment happening here to upgrade our fermenters to be able to produce a closed loop system to get our biology out and off, in the best shape out to the customers every day.
And I should mention there that this is something that is not EPA regulated. There's no government mandates that is coming down that is making us do this. This is something that we're making sure that we take the steps that there is, when we talk about being 100% not genetically modified, non-pathogenic, right? That means no negative biology can exist in our products. So when we deliver 401 or Biocast or 501 or Meltdown or 301, whatever it might be that you're using today, we know that when that product goes out the door that we can say that there is nothing pathogenic in it. And we're taking these steps and we're investing in this. Again, nothing mandated about it. This is something that we're doing to make sure that we can stay true to who we are.
Yeah, this is not bathtub biology.
That's a fact.
So other investment is partnerships. And I mentioned this, Agronomy 365. This is a tool that we'd like to see get on as many farms, every farm out there. This is validating what we're doing with soil tests, with tissue testing, because as we apply products, we want to understand why they work and how they work. And if something doesn't work, we're using this to validate, to understand what we can do better to make better recommendations going forward.
Sean, is this something that growers only have to be pushing for 350 bushel corn or 100 bushel beans in the National Corn Grower Contest to utilize something like the Soil and Tissue Program?
No, obviously those guys would want to, the 365 program is definitely a big tool for those guys that are pushing for those high ends. But as costs go up, we look at what input prices are right now. All we want to do is utilize something to make sure that we're spending our dollars and being as efficient with our fertility money, with the dollars that we spend as possible, and validating, even a decision on dry spread fertilizer, things like that. Are those providing economic returns? If we apply MAP or DAP or potash and we pull the tissue, are we seeing those products, those nutrients getting into the plant? So we want to use that to make sure the things we've done for 50, 60 years, make sure that those are the economical and the right things to do on the farm.
So appreciate Sean really giving an update of kind of where we're going. You got to see where we've been, where we're going, and how are we going to get there? We're going to get there by focusing on innovation, Biodyne is going to continue to bring the best-in-class microbials, bringing new technologies, products like BioCast Plus, adding new microbes into our teams and our team combinations, looking at bringing remediation of pesticides and herbicides, also looking at bioinsecticides. Bringing new technologies like PD, PDP. You might be asking yourself, what are those? Well, if you're on Twitter, they kind of took Twitter by storm this summer with a lot of pictures that we had seen. PD is pixie dust. Yes, you did hear that correctly. This is an ag product that is called pixie dust. PDP is Pixie Dust Plus. We trialed Pixie Dust Plus this year on about 60,000 acres company-wide, seeing some phenomenal results come in. Growers extremely happy with that product. Also have products like BW Advance, Rhizoactivate, C-Amino, Entrust, BioZinc, Fixate, products like that and more. We're focused on developing new technologies and continuing to provide our customers with best-in-class products, all while proving them through the Agronomy 365 that Sean said. We don't bring a new product to the market if we don't validate it first. And that might be yield, but that also is going to be, does the product do what they say it's going to do? Functional, in 2022, we will have a functional production melt plant, 3 biological fermentation facilities that will be improved and upgraded, 2 full-service microbiology labs, and distribution points across the entire U.S. Adding several new blend-out locations, building custom blends and formulas that are direct and farm-ready. We're also going to get there by focused on research. Not with us today, but a name that you are going to hear about, and I can't even begin to describe, and Sean and I were talking about this last night. There's really not words to put in the importance of Mason Claude, who is our agronomy research lead. Mason is straight out of Iowa State University with an agronomy degree. He has done trials all over, really all over the U.S. He's crunched data all over the U.S., focused on running a lot of trials throughout the entire growing season. And we're going to continue to do that, and we're going to even, I would say we're going to put an even greater emphasis on bringing more research locations and sites to be able to invite you as our growers and our customers to come and tour our facilities and look at these new technologies in the field. We're going to continue to use the soil and tissue tests, pairing it all with yield. We're going to focus on the right program, a balanced approach. This is what the BW difference is. People ask after they've heard our presentations, they say, Bodie, are you anti-fertilizer? Sean, are you anti-fertilizer? The answer is no, we're not. We're just pro-farmer efficiency and really focused on our growers' bottom line. The goal is to reach $100 million in sales in 5 years, and that's only going to happen by building relationships, doing business the right way, and earning your trust and dealers' trust every day. So we talked a little bit about it earlier. I talked a little bit about it earlier with Biodyne. We're science-backed, farmer-first, farmer-focused. We're leveraging 30 years of research and development with our robust microbial team technology that has been developed in-house and proven in the field. Elevate synergy, increase nutrient cycling, and stimulate vigor. None of this is possible without these folks here. So we got to make sure that we take a time and recognize these people. All started with Dr. Fred Farley out of Sarasota, Florida. We've got Tyler Schumann, who's our microbial manager in Fort Wayne. We have Garth Farley, who's our national production director, who oversees all production facilities. We have Michelle Wells, who is production and lab director in our Fonda, Iowa location. Tim Goodpasture out of Tulsa, Oklahoma is a production partner. We have Grant Farley that is joining us just recently. He's a recent grad of Ball State with a degree in biology. He's a microbiology and a production assistant manager, as well as Lane Cahan, who is down in Sarasota, Florida as well with Dr. Farley.
So as I mentioned earlier, the BW Fusion difference is people, products, and proof. And we do that because we have an incredible team, both internal and external. Our products, as you try them and you use them, you'll find that we've got the best-in-class technologies and the proof, and that's the Agronomy 365 partnership with those soil and tissue tests to kind of validate what we're doing going forward.
Welcome back, everybody. Appreciate you tuning in for last week's episode. This week we wanted to take it a little bit different. We kind of gave you a where we've been, where we're going, who we are, and really what drives us. Today we wanted to do something. Sean and I wanted to do something that was I'd say more near and dear to our heart. We can talk about products, we can talk about company, we can talk about a lot of those things. But this right here is really it's what brought us together. Well, I guess thanks to Twitter, probably 4 years ago.
Yeah.
4 years ago, Sean had sent me a message. We'd connected, followed back and forth. He had seen what I was doing with the Next Level Ag soil sampling and swap maps, and was just intrigued, wanted to learn more. One conversation led to another, and I guess we became friends out of the deal. So I guess we have this soil test to thank for bringing us together. But really what we wanted to do is just unpack a indicator complete soil sample. So for those of you that participated in Agronomy 365, you saw a indicator complete soil test. You also would have got a tissue test. With that, you might have been slightly overwhelmed. If it's the first time that you have looked at an indicator complete soil sample, you're probably looking at this and saying, boy, this is nothing like what I'm used to. So whether you used a Bray P1, whether you used a malic extract, whether it was an Olsen extract, maybe it was ammonium acetate for your calcium, for potassium, whatever it was, what I had done is a traditional soil test, and I mean traditional, is one that has been widely used, widely accepted, as this right here on the left-hand side. So what you're looking at is the left-hand side is the chemical extract or the chemical component, the right-hand side is the biological. It's easy to get overwhelmed. I completely understand it. There's 48 different metrics that we're measuring here that we're looking at with an indicator complete versus 12 on a standard soil test.
Yeah.
So Sean came from the world that you know, I think he felt like and we've had conversations, you know, he said, I could make a recommendation in a matter of 30 seconds.
30 seconds.
45 seconds on looking at a soil test, on a traditional soil test. And he said, you know, now that you brought this mess to me, he said, I can't make one in an hour. And so I'm sure that if this is something that you're not doing every day, that you're not studying every day, you're probably looking at this and saying, what are the critical components? What do I need to be focused on? What is it telling me? And why do you have both of these? So lucky for you, today we're going to unpack that. So I'm going to let Sean go ahead and just kind of talk about that left-hand side of the soil test, what he's looking at, things to pay attention to, and what he would be doing managing just off of that.
Sure. Thanks, Bodie. So I guess I'm classically trained in soil fertility using whether it's the University of Illinois Agronomy Handbook method or the tri-state method that comes from, you know, Purdue, Ohio State, Michigan State, I think. And a lot of the similar things, their approaches are very similar. So we've got an organic matter. You know, we just general rule of thumb that I see a 3% organic matter and I say, well, that's pretty good because, you know, where I'm at in Southeast Illinois, we see a lot of anywhere from, you know, 0.8 to, you know, maybe 2 or 3. And if we see 3+, that's usually in our black ground that doesn't drain very well. So we're not really accustomed to seeing good organic matter levels. I see a surface nitrogen. So this test is taken on a 0 to 6 inch sample. So I just see some real basic, you know, say there's 16 pounds of N in that 0 to 6 inch a sample. We go to phosphorus. So this is where you go classically trained and you talk about making a quick recommendation. I see, okay, I got a Bray P1, part per million of 35.1 parts per million. So we're in Illinois, where I'm at. So we do everything in pounds per acre. So, okay, 35.1 times 2 is 70 pound to the acre of phosphorus. And so instantly I look at that and say, I'm not applying any phosphorus on this soil. I think our basic recommendations at Tri-State's 15 part per million, so around 30 pound to the acre is kind of a cutoff on applications. University of Illinois recommendations, I think, are still somewhere in the ballpark of 30 to 50 pound to the acre is maybe a maintenance. Anything above 50, we're not going to apply any phosphate fertilizer. I look at potassium, again, part per million, it's 150 times 2, so I look at that and say, okay, that's a 300 pound to the acre potassium score. I can't remember the tri-states right off the top of my head, but I know the University of Illinois for Southeast Illinois and our low CEC soils that we have. I look at that, it's 300 pounds to the acre, so I'm building to, if I'm trying to build, I'm going to build to maybe 260. And so I'm saying, okay, even though I may be, just off the cuff real quick, even if I'm 40 pounds higher than what that build number is, we all know that potassium is a tough metric to build in the soil. So I may still apply, 75 or 80 pound, of potash there just to make sure if I'm using this left side of a standard, just so we don't mind those numbers any. And then we get to calcium, and so this is where I start to look for a base saturation, but I think one anecdotal story is when I first started in retail, when I got out of college, we would get soil tests back and we never even got base saturation numbers. They did not exist in our reports. The people the kind of the powers that be thought that farmers aren't using that, they're not paying attention to that number, so there's no reason to put it there. It was amazing when I saw the first base saturation number, that changed my mindset on a soil sample as well. But so I was kind of honestly glossed over the calcium, the mag numbers, and then I looked down to the micronutrients on here. And realistically, there's some useful information with your micros, but also I've kind of always believed that soil testing for a micro is kind of tricky. It's maybe not the most accurate information, but I think the key take home, if you're looking at just a standard soil test, is look at, let's say use sulfur, for example. Sulfur, boron are two nutrients that get a lot of play in our world. I look at that 7.6 parts per million, that tells me 15 pounds to the acre. In my sandier soils, I say that's low. So, whether or not I trust that number to be incredibly accurate, I can look at that and say, okay, we need to apply some sulfur. I see 0.7 parts per million boron, I know, and we know from doing other analysis in tissue that basically a boron level at a 0.7, we're going to be applying some boron in season and trying to get those numbers up. So you may not trust the micro numbers as maybe the gospel, but if they're really low on a soil test, they're probably going to be really low and not getting those into the plant. And then finally, I'm looking at the bottom at pH, and we've got a 7.2 pH in this case, so I just kind of ballpark, I'm not going to spread any lime. I'm not going to pay much attention to that number in most cases until I see it get below 6.5 and maybe below 6 and into the 5s. If we had a pH below 7, in this case, we would get a buffer pH number. And that's how we really determine, how much lime we're going to apply. Another kind of funny anecdotal thing is the University of Illinois Agronomy Handbook does not use buffer pH to determine lime. It's basically using organic matter and some numbers and some voodoo magic, and we create a lime recommendation that way. So always get that base saturation because that's really the best way to kind of determine what we're going to do with lime.
So as we transition from the explanation of a standard chemical soil test and how do you use it, right? For those of you, again, and I've referenced this a lot because I've talked about it since day one of coming here to Biodyne, the reason that we use an indicator soil sample is because the definition of soil is physical, chemical, and biological. And my frustration is that the industry has widely adapted and used just the chemical standpoint. So we've only really looked at our soils chemically only. So if you want to break it out on an even percentage, it's 33%, right? So we're making recommendations for fertility that in a year like this year, we're talking $250 to $300 an acre for a 2-year spread off of just looking at 1/3 of the soil. So this is where we bring in the biological and the physical piece. So if you will follow along here, I'm going to start at the top. I'm going to kind of give you some numbers, what they are, what they mean, and what can we do to change that. So the very top number that you see there is HT3 24-hour CO2 burst. So that is a measurement of biological respiration, right? So that is just giving us an idea of how active that soil is from the release of carbon dioxide through biological activity. The very next one is VAST. So that's a measurement of soil structure, soil aggregation, soil stability. Okay, so that's telling us, is that soil tightly compacted, or is that soil going to allow roots to penetrate and move through there? So a VAS score of 31 is a fairly impressive VAS score. I've seen VAS scores as low as 3 in our environments. I've seen them as high as 45 in our environments. You typically see those 45 and above VAS scores on soils that have been long-term no-till or cover crops, things like that. If you're in a tillage rotation, it's awful hard to get that VAS score above that 40, 45 mark from what I've seen. The next one, what we're looking at is H2O nitrate. So that's water-soluble nitrate. So if anything, just a quick reminder, if this is the first time you've ever had it explained, anything ATE is leachable, right? Sulfate, phosphate, nitrate, okay? So anything in that nitrate form, so this would be NO3 minus, right? A negative charge, it would be an anion. Your soils are negatively charged, right? So there's nothing to hold that ion there. So we get a heavy rain event, we have 16 pounds of nitrate sitting in the soil system that could be leached through that profile and out the tile lines. This is a soil sample. I should have said this is a soil sample behind corn this year. It was a 200 bushel corn crop pulled off of this. This is a limestone underlay, which probably gives us a little bit of indication onto that 7.2 pH.
Sure.
It's got some topsoil, but there is a limestone gravel underlay underneath this soil.
What's your lime history on this farm?
Yeah, so we haven't put lime on this in over 6 years. And we have been, and we'll talk more about this farm. This is a field that we've done. It's my home farm. That we've done something a little bit unique here. But one of the things that really stood out to me is that we've not put lime on in 6 years. And that's coming from previously, we would be on a 2-year soil sample, and we would typically spread, lime as they called for. Turn around soil sample the next 2 years, put lime as they called for, and we were traditionally about 185 pounds of MAP and 310, 315 pounds of potash for a 2-year spread with a 200 bushel corn crop, 210 with a 60 bushel bean crop.
Sure.
So we move down to H2O ammoniacal. So that's anything that would be ammonium nitrogen. So that's NH4. So that's a positive or a cation. So that's pretty safe, right? Unless that gets converted. But as we cool down, we know that your nitrifying bacteria are also going to cool down. So whatever's in that ammoniacal form is pretty well safe for the wintertime. So we have 2.5 pounds of ammoniacal nitrogen sitting in the soil. SLAN is slow labile amino nitrogen. So what that is that's a biological function or form of nitrogen. So it's already in a protein form. It's an amino acid. There's no conversion necessary. It's a very, very, very efficient form of nitrogen. So the higher that number on your SLAN, what that is telling you is how efficient your soil is at creating or releasing biological nitrogen. The next one we look at is C to N, so that's the carbon to nitrogen ratio. And I think one of the things that maybe is most misunderstood with the carbon to nitrogen ratio is that you could Google or look at any agronomy handbook and see the different carbon to nitrogen ratios of residue, right? And so you bring soybeans or you bring corn or you bring wheat, and so you get it in your head, okay, well, if that's a 56-to-1, then my soil should be a 56-to-1.
Right.
But as you can see here, this is a 6.6. So what is this telling us? Your carbon to nitrogen ratio is, that number is from taking your organic in, so right below it, divided by your WEOC, and that is what gets you your carbon to nitrogen ratio. So take your organic in divided by 2, divided by WEOC, and that is where your carbon to nitrogen ratio is. So a question that you might have, if this is the first time that you've had it explained to you is okay, that's great, but what am I doing with that, right? What is that data telling me? Well, what it tells me is that if I went and applied nitrogen, let's say it's 150 pounds, that nitrogen is going to be released earlier in the growing season rather than later in the growing season. So my soils are not going to really act like a stabilizer, if you will. If I have soluble or available nitrogen, it's going to be released fairly early. If I start getting upwards of 13, 15, 16, 17 on a carbon to nitrogen ratio, I know that I need to ban some early season nitrogen because I'm not going to get that availability.
Right.
My soils are going to hold on to it. As we move down into organic N, so that is N that is not plant available. So you see WEON there just to the right. That's water extractable organic nitrogen. So that is nitrogen that is going to be, that needs to be converted before it ever gets recognized as being plant available. So inorganic N is just taking your H2O nitrate, added with your H2O ammoniacal, and that gives you your plant available. So we have 18.7 pounds of total plant available in today. You move below that, that's our MACWEON, so that's your microbial activity, water extractable organic nitrogen. Move below that is your WEOC, so WEOC. So WEOC is your water extractable organic carbon, which is the available carbon or the food source that drives the entire biological system. There's been some tremendous work done out of Penn State where they looked at biological activity and organic matter. I think that the industry wants to make organic matter maybe too big of a deal or a bigger deal than what it actually is.
Right.
And the R value was 0.47. So there was no consistency with biological respiration and organic matter. However, when compared to WEOC, that R value went to an 87. So significantly closer correlation, and that is why we use WEOC, looking at the biological side of the soils.
So if we stop right here for a second on this nitrogen section and just real quick on, say, a nitrogen recommendation on this soil sample. And I think this is something that we want to go deeper into as we go through the series. But if we just look at this test right here, Bodie, what do you see? I see a 35 SLAN, I see a 6,6 carbon and nitrogen, and I've got 38 pounds of estimated nitrogen release. So if you're going to apply nitrogen based on this sample right now, just real quick, are you putting it up front? Are you side dressing some of this? What are your thoughts?
Yeah, so one of the big things that we talk about, and I think it can't be dismissed, is agronomics, economics, and logistics, right? It's something that we talk an awful lot about, and it's one that we stay very true to. So what do I mean by that? I mean that agronomically I may come with one recommendation. Economically may force me to another.
Sure.
And logistics may force me to another. And so we have to look at that grower, and we have to look at what is his equipment, right? What is the equipment availability? What is his manpower availability? Can he side dress? Can he not? And that's where we have to work, and that's where this system becomes extremely more complicated and not just cut and dry. The easy answer would be is the grower puts all of his nitrogen up front typically, so let's do it, and that's what we're going to do.
Right.
If we're looking at this data and we're going to pretend that he's got the manpower, right, and that everything is on the table, for me, I would look at putting a little bit of nitrogen up front early to get it started. My CN is not super low, a 2 or a 3 carbon to nitrogen ratio, so my soils are going to hold on to that a little bit.
Sure.
So I want a little bit, whether that's 2x2, whether that's weed and feed, whether that's a dry broadcast of some AMS incorporated in, whatever it might be. I would look at getting a little bit of nitrogen there early. Then I would look at coming back and side dressing. And the reason that I would be looking at side dressing is simply because our soils, if we give them the opportunity to put 150 or 180 pounds of nitrogen in that soil, it's going to release sooner rather than later.
Sure.
So I want to make sure that I've got enough nitrogen extended into grain fill to prolong that grain fill period and make sure that I can keep that plant alive and healthy. So in a perfect world, it's a little shoddy of in early, come back and side dress, or maybe it's a V8Y drop if this grower does. For example, on our farm, we do not have a high clearance sprayer. We do not have Y drops available, so side dress would have to be the best option for us.
Well, I think the reason I brought that up, and it's not to sidetrack us off of what we're talking about, but it's how we're using these advanced metrics on this indicator to help us make decisions that we don't get from a standard soil test. We're looking at that nitrogen section, and as we analyze our fields, if we see more of that across the farm as we pull these tests, then maybe we start to look at what equipment we need, what we need to do to put in place to maybe look at things a little differently than what we have in the past.
100%. 100%. So as we move from nitrogen, that top section being focused on microbial activity, soil structure, and then nitrogen, we move into phosphorus, and this is where things get a little bit interesting for me. So you might be asking yourself, okay, well, Sean talked about, I got a 35.1 part per million Bray, right? Or 70 pounds if you're in Illinois. And we come over here to the H3AP and it's showing 16 and a half. Well, how could we have a discrepancy of 19 part per million or 38 pounds here? And if you're asking yourself that, I'm glad that you did. Let me help you understand that. So on the left-hand side of a chemical extract, and this is not, please don't take this as any sort of slight of any sort of me attacking the standard soil test. This is just reality. A malic, a bray, and Olsen extract are harsher acids that exist in soil, right? We're not going to have a lot of bray acids or ammonium acetate, if you will, that's released by that plant. So what we look at, and when we come up with an H3A reading, is that's using root exudates and deionized water as the extraction. So a much softer acid for an extract. So that's going to, this number, when you see H3A, anytime you see H3A, whether it's phosphorus, potassium, calcium, iron, or aluminum, that is simply telling us what that plant recognizes at that time.
Sure.
Okay, so it's looking at it at that time, what is the plant recognizing as available phosphorus? So that's where your discrepancy comes from. That's where your chemical soil test versus what is more biological, what is actually plant available, that's where your discrepancy comes from. So as you break through that, we've got 14.1 part per million in an inorganic, so that would be readily plant available. We have 2.4 part per million in the organic phosphorus, so we're going to need to convert organic to inorganic. Gives us 33.7 pounds of available P2O5. This next one, P saturation, might be the first time that you've ever seen that. So what is P saturation? That is your total available P divided by all potential tie-ups. Right, so we think about that. We know that phosphorus is negatively charged, which makes it what? An anion, right? We know that calcium is a positive charge, which makes it a cation, right? We also know that iron and aluminum are also cations, right? So that number is looking at your total available P divided by your calciums divided by your iron and aluminums to show you how much of that is available, right? What percent is available that's not going to be tied up. As we move down into potassium, we'll cut this.
Just click.
So as we move into potassium, we see an H3A of K. So Sean described a little bit earlier, we have 151 part per million potassium. In his soils, that would be, a go to zero, if you will, right?
Sure.
You said you might put a little bit of a, 75 or 80 pounds, make sure that K is not your limiting factor. But we come over here to the H3A and we're looking at a 40. So what does that tell us? Well, that tells me, if I'm looking at this soil sample, that if I'm under really 65 or 70, that I'm going to have to apply some supplemental potash because the soil's not going to replace itself efficiently enough. I start getting 65 and above on a ppm H3AK, I know that that soil has the ability to replenish itself with the pool of available potassium.
Sure.
Right? We move down into calcium. We're at 414 part per million, and you see that that's a low reading. In an ideal world, for me, if I could get that into the 600s, that's a really good day. That is a number that is extremely difficult. You think about it, right? We have 2,666 pounds, so call it almost 2,700 for easy math. So 5,400 pounds. Excuse me, that was part per million. So 5,400, 52, 5,300 pounds. Yet I only have 800 pounds that is plant available.
Well, that's interesting, Bodie, because you got a pH of 7.2. So that says we don't need any lime, and you're telling me I need calcium, and generally the way I get calcium is by spreading more lime.
Correct. Correct. So this is where, so what would be some available calcium sources that you could look at, right? Are we above that 65% base sat? The answer is yes, we are. Gypsum comes into play. If I need to try to drive that calcium, H3A calcium number, then gypsum is the source that I'm going to use. I don't want to use lime because I don't want to make my pH any higher than what it already is. Then we move down, you can see your iron and aluminum. Those being very low, that's a good thing. That just tells us that we don't have iron and aluminum that's going to tie up our phosphorus. And iron and aluminum typically shows up in low pHs, which makes perfect sense. As your soil gets more acidic, iron and aluminum become way more active.
Right.
We're at a 7.2, it's not going to be very active, which means that it's not coming up and it's not tying up our phosphorus. So all we have to work through really is our calcium tying up our phosphorus.
That's right.
Right? And how do we do that? So we look down here, we're at a 17 CEC, 2.3 base sat K, 19.7 base sat mag, 77.7 base sat calcium, and a sodium of 0.3. Now, you could be looking at this and you could say, boy, your K levels are sure in the tank, right?
Sure.
Well, how can I change that? How can I make that to 6 or 7 or some people even saying you got to get to 10? Well, how am I going to do that? Well, if you're asking that at home, stay tuned, because here in the next couple of minutes, we're actually going to go to the whiteboard and we're going to look at base saturations and really how to manipulate them, how to change them, but what it's really telling us.
Sure.
That's what we're going to go through. A little bit of a backstory on this farm that I got to share. So this is, like I said, this is a home farm for us. This has been 5 years of continuous corn. It has been a cereal rye cover crop after each one of those corn crops. We then graze about 40 cows on 40 acres. The interesting thing about this is that we've not applied any synthetic phosphorus in 5 years. Okay? So you might be saying, okay, well, you must have started with a Bray P1 of 70 if you haven't applied any phosphorus.
Are you mining that soil?
Because we've been told that mines our soils, right? If you don't apply synthetic fertilizer, then you're going to mine that soil. In fact, it's actually just the opposite. I was looking at these samples back to some samples from 5 years ago, and we were actually in that 15 to 17 part per million range. And our soils are actually building. And in the last 2 years, we have used Meltdown and 401 on this farm, and our numbers have actually climbed significantly more in the last 2 years. So I don't want to dismiss this, right? And I don't want this to just be all about product, but I also am a guy that let the data tell you what it is and look at the data, understand it. So for 3 years, we've had cattle on this system. We've seen a gradual increase in our phosphorus, on the standard soil test. Right. But over the last 2 years, when using the cattle and the corn and the cover crops and bringing in beneficial microbes, that number has exponentially increased. This is something that I was showing my dad, as we were talking about this with fertilizer prices getting high. He said, I want to see what else I can cut, right? If I'm going to continue to use Meltdown and 401, what else can I cut? And so I took the time and I walked him through and I said, Dad, for 5 years, you haven't put any phosphorus on this. In that same time, in 5 years, we've only put 75 pounds of potash. For 5 years, being corn on corn with a cover crop, we've been over 200 bushels. Previous to the 5 years, our best yield on that farm was 198. Now, I told you it's a light river bottom with a gravel underlay, that even in a wet year, you can still see some dry spots show up. So what am I getting at? I'm getting at is that through the use of, one, understanding our soils, that they're not just chemically, understanding that there is a biological component to it, and bringing in beneficial microbes and understanding the environment that you're working with, adding livestock in, we're seeing things that we didn't think, or that we've been taught couldn't happen. Right? Because we're taught that if you don't put removal rates on, or removal plus some, that we're going to mine that soil. And reality is we're actually getting stronger. We continue to get stronger.
Well, I think it's interesting. I think that is phenomenal. Obviously, you've got the beneficial microbes that you're applying with the Meltdown, the 401. You've got the cereal rye doing something. You've got a little bit of manure from your cattle.
Yep.
All right. So you're getting a lot of biological processes happening. You look at our phosphorus numbers, and your Bray is increasing, right? And so we look at our H3A phos, and you'd say, well, okay, well, maybe we need to apply a little here. Well, I think this comes back to your Meltdown 401 conversation, right? Is when you talk about that extraction, like you did, deionized water, root exudates, and then we look at the Bray, which is a little bit more of maybe like a hammer and chisel, trying to knock some of that phos off there.
Yep.
We know that phosphorus is released to us by biological activity.
Yep.
So you're increasing it with your 401, you're increasing that with your Meltdown, and then you've got root activity happening. So even the native biology are doing some different things out there. You're getting biology in the manure. You're making. Basically, what's happening is it's not look at one, look at the other, decide which one you want to be. You realize that the difference between your Bray and your H3A is what's really available out there, and we're using the biology to make that phos more available. You're seeing similar things with your potassium. You're getting some of that, your biology maybe making some more of that K available. It's why your K numbers aren't doing anything drastic that you wouldn't expect.
So, Sean, this is something, I've heard. We've obviously referenced the Agronomy 365 platform. This is a fall soil sample. If I got a fall soil sample and I can look at this, why do I need to take anything in season? Like what are we taking in season that we're getting that we're not getting with a fall soil sample today? And why are we so adamant about taking a soil and a tissue paired together?
Well, I think that's a good question because we want to validate. All right, so we're going to use this. We're going to make a plan. You've made your plan. Now we want to validate to make sure that was the right plan. And every year is a little bit different, right? But if we take that in-season soil, we see the things that we change. I think even from the nitrogen perspective, if we've got a load of organic N out there, we know that that's not plant available. We're doing things to try to, as opposed to maybe just, putting an extra 50 pounds of nitrogen out there, what are we doing? Can we make that organic N available? Can we convert that to inorganic N that's available to our crops?
Well, how are you going to do that? How are you going to take non-plant available nitrogen and make it available?
I'm going to use meltdown, and I'm going to use biology to do that.
So you're telling me that you're taking a soil sample to prove out products that the industry calls snake oils. Aren't you afraid that it could show something that you don't want to see?
Am I afraid? No. Is that possible? Yes. Not every. This is the whole point. Is a soil sample, whether it's a standard or whether it's the indicator complete, is a snapshot in time. That soil, we think about it when we're making fertilizer recommendations that we just think about it in pounds and tons. All right. That number's this. We're going to apply this. That number's this. We're going to apply that. It's a living, breathing creature just like you or I. So it's not going to always do what we expect it to do. It's impossible to take something living and run a mathematical calculation and say if we do X, we get Y, right? And so if we can validate that in season and we can see where we're hitting it right, maybe where we're hitting it a little bit off, and it gives us an opportunity. Maybe we don't, maybe we're not equipped, maybe we don't have the ability to make changes while that crop is growing, but we can use that information with our planned samples, our fall samples, or if you're a spring sampler, however you sample, we can use those things to make that plan better going forward and try to improve on what we do, as opposed to just kind of doing what we've always done. Maybe, once we spread our fertilizer and walk away and say, okay, that's what the crop's got to eat, this gives us an ability to see what's becoming available, what we can do to change that as we go forward.
Well, I feel like that you hit on a couple things, and now you probably have got people just sitting on by the edge of their seat here and wondering for more. You said something in there that you said something about organic N, and if I had a big pool of organic N, instead of applying 50 more pounds of nitrogen, you're going to use biology,
sure,
to react that.
Yeah, we've seen that because our biology didn't say a product like Meltdown. And Meltdown's a good option for there because Meltdown's thing is it's kind of known as a residue degrader, right? It releases things from residue, it breaks down the residue and makes, whether tillage is easier to apply. I look at it as it's releasing nutrients back to the plant, right? And if I have organic N in the fall and I don't have any living roots, so I don't have a crop out there to capture what it releases, then it can theoretically be complexed back in the soil. Right? Now, if I'm after residue degradation, that's exactly what I want it to do. But if I look at if I have an organic N in the soil and I see that and I say, okay, I need this to convert to inorganic, then I might use a product such as Meltdown that degrades residues and releases nutrients back to the soil. And if I can do that, I can convert organic N to inorganic N and make that plant available. And that can happen in the course of a season. You can do that while the crop is growing and get that benefit that same year.
Okay, hold on. We started talking about a soil test, trying to help these guys understand what a soil test was, trying to take them through that. And you just dropped a knowledge bomb like that. We can't put this in the same episode. We got this, surely we have to expand on this, right?
Well,
is this something, are you telling me that you could talk about Meltdown and you could talk about from a scientific level of how you can prove it to me, right? If I'm a skeptic, I want to know how you know that your microbes are converting organic N to inorganic N, right? I want to know, you can talk that through?
Sure, I think we can, because I think what happens is if you actively see that, then let's say you have a large pool of organic N, right? And we've seen customers do this, right? This is why we have confidence to say this, is we have a large pool of organic N, and if that grower says, well, my tissue isn't what I want it to be on nitrogen or something like that. I believe you made a recommendation on a case just like this, where you had a large pool of organic N. The grower wanted to make a nitrogen application because he wasn't seeing maybe what he wanted to see in his tissue. You made an application, I think you Y-drop Meltdown, you place Meltdown in the rhizosphere, so you're placing that right by the roots because realistically, if we're going to make something available, we want it to be available where the roots are. You know, it doesn't matter if we do something right in the middle of the row. If it's late in the season, we may not have an opportunity to capture that. So you wide drop the meltdown, and you pulled the same soil test, you know, I think a couple weeks later, and you realize that not only did your pool of inorganic N go down because your plant's still growing, your crop is still growing. So, you know, just like a straw, that crop of corn was still pulling that nitrogen out of the soil, but also you saw, I think, like a 50-pound reduction in that organic N pool. And so while I can't, you know, I don't live in the soil, I don't know what exactly happened. I'm gonna deduct, you know, my hypothesis is you had a pool of organic N. You made an application of meltdown, which is a consortium of biology that releases nutrients, makes them plant available, and 2 weeks later pulled the same soil test, and your organic N pool was reduced by 50 pounds, and your tissue number didn't change. It didn't go down. Your inorganic number went down, so we know the plant's using that, and yeah, so I believe that the data is proving what we're talking about.
All right. This is definitely another episode because I got a lot of questions that I'm curious now on. I feel like we talked a little bit about base sats, but we ran out of time. We can't describe it right now. I think we ought to go to the whiteboard. I don't know about you. I'm a visual guy.
Sure.
Let's go to the whiteboard. Let's break down base saturations. Let's break down how we could build fertility, how we could maintain fertility, and how that works.
And then maybe do another episode. It sounds like we need to do another episode just talking about biology and nitrogen and phosphorus and some of these things.
I'm down with that.
Sounds great.
So in the last on the last episode, if you were with us, we talked about how to read and interpret a soil test. We went through the chemical side, we went through the biological side, and we talked just a little bit about base saturations. And I would say, I don't know about you, Sean, but for me, that's a question that a lot of people always ask me. How do I read base sats? How do I interpret base sats? What are they really telling me? And then the most common thing is of course, how do I increase them, right? How do I improve the nutrients in there? And I think maybe the easiest way to do that is to just come to the whiteboard. I have a couple examples that I like to use that really, in my opinion, help maybe make sense of base saturations and how it works. So we're going to use the soil sample that we used in the previous week's episode. So we've got a 17 CEC. So we have a CEC of 17, which CEC, for those that you might not be familiar, is cation exchange capacity. As we move over to the base sats, we have a base sat calcium of 78%, magnesium of 20%, potassium of 2%. We have a hydrogen reading of 0, and a sodium reading of 0. Now, what this is this is a calculation of your cations that are used to calculate what those total base sats are. Now, if you have high levels of sodium readings, that's typically not a good thing, not something that we want to see. Sean actually would be a little more familiar in his area behind and lower CECs and some sands, reclaimed oil wells. We don't typically see that where we're at here in central Indiana, and as we move across central Illinois into central Iowa, sodium's not something that we typically struggle with. Hydrogen, so hydrogen occupies the space that calcium wants to. So what I tell people is, if you see a hydrogen show up on your soil test, the very, very, very next place that you should instantly look would be your pH, right? And so what that's telling you is that if you have exchangeable hydrogen that shows up, not that hydrogen is a bad thing, but it helps you understand that if you have hydrogen there, you likely have a little bit lower pH. And if you remember, Sean talked about this was a 7.2 pH soil. We knew that it has a limestone gravel underlay, likely why our pHs are typically more elevated on this piece of ground. So we've got a hydrogen of 0, obviously because of where our pH is at. So here's what we're going to go through. So we talked about calcium being a 78%. We talked about magnesium being 20%, potassium being 2%. So I usually use this thinking about a dinner table, right? You know, most of the time you've seen me hidden behind the chair, but if you look, I don't get a rockin' body like this missing dinner, okay? So I like to use a dinner table because it resonates with me. So we're going to think about this big old circular table here, right? So we got this big circular table here, which represents our CEC, right? And so Sean's already got this. That means that there's 17, we're gonna call these 17 chairs, or representing an exchange site. So there's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16, 17. Okay, so here's our CECs. This is each one of them. So this equals a CEC of 17. So that means that we have 17 exchange sites to be able to hold these cations. So I'm not good enough at math to be able to do this in my head, so we're going to have to pull out our calculators and we're going to calculate this. So Sean, if I have a CEC of 17 and my base sat calcium is 78%, how many chairs do I have occupied by calcium?
13.26 chairs.
Okay, so we're going to take this one, we're going to occupy him, this one as well, this one as well, this one, one more, 1, 2, 3, 4.
Yep, that's 13.
Okay, and then 0.26, right? 0.26
Yep.
of this one is calcium as well. All right, now we move down and we go from calcium, then we go to magnesium, and we're at 20%. So we have a CEC of 17, our mag is 20%. How many chairs do we have occupied now by?
3.4 chairs.
Okay, so now we have 0.4 of this one is mag. Then we have mag, we have mag, and we have mag. Now, for those of you that are looking at home, you're looking at this and you're saying, okay, that's a whole lot of calcium, that's a whole lot of magnesium, but all I hear about is how important potassium is. So where does potassium get to have a seat at the table? So if I have a base saturation of potassium at 2, on a CEC of 17, how many chairs do I have occupied by potassium?
0.34 chairs.
0.34 chairs. So I have the remaining of this is 0.34 occupied by potassium. Now, this is where the story gets a little bit more interesting. Okay, so let's talk about charges, right? In the last episode, we talked a little bit about cations, we talked about anions, and we just talked about base saturations are all cations, right? There's no anions that go into being figured into your base saturation. So calcium, for those of you that are at home, I'll give you a second to answer this, right? Is calcium a 1, a 2, a 3, or a 4 plus charge, right? Well, we know that calcium is a 2 plus charge, right? So calcium would be designated with a 2 plus charge, so you would typically see it Ca++, right? Magnesium, same question. Is it a 1, a 2, a 3, or a 4 plus charge? We know that it is also a 2 plus charge. We get into potassium. Sean, is that a 1 or a 2 plus charge?
It's a 1.
How about hydrogen?
It's a 1.
How about sodium?
It's a 1.
Okay, now, if you guys didn't love chemistry in school, you might have not paid attention to this. And if you didn't pay attention to this, no worries. I didn't pay attention either. It is extremely difficult. And when I say extremely difficult, I mean, let's just call it impossible for a single plus charge cation to ever displace a 2 plus charge cation. So what am I telling you? I'm telling you is that look at your base saturation. Sean made a comment earlier in the last session and he said, I always want to make sure that I'm looking at base saturations. Why? Everybody has a little bit of a different reason for why looking at base saturations, right? pH is great. Buffer pH is also great. Understanding, do I need to be adding lime? Base saturation calcium is going to share a couple of things with you. One, if I have a really high base saturation soil, I likely have a soil that is probably properly flocculated, right?
Right.
Not going to be terrible drainage. Now, if I have a low calcium and a high magnesium, what do I have, Sean?
That soil's going to be tight.
I have a tight soil, one that's probably going to respond to some sort of a tillage. It's going to respond to gypsum application, anything that you can do to drive soluble calcium in there to improve flocculation of that soil so that you get some percolation of water.
So think about it, if you walk out in a field in the springtime, I always use this analogy. I remember when I was a kid, my dad and I, we used to like to go arrowhead hunting out in the fields, right? And you'd do that in the spring or in the wintertime when things were wet. And so you'd have your rubber boots on, and when you walk across a field, if every step you take, if the mud sticks a little tighter to the boots and you're constantly flinging your leg to kick that off, that's a pretty good indication of a higher mag soil. The stickier that soil, generally the higher the mag level.
Yep. So now that we know, you got a little bit of a chemistry lesson with Sean and Bodie here, right? So we know that we have a 2 plus charge, 2 plus charge, 1 plus charge, 1 plus charge, 1 plus charge. Now, these two 1 plus charge have 0%, right? They don't register on the base saturation, very low concentrations, okay? Not a bad thing, not a great thing. It is what it is. Now, if I'm looking at this and Sean comes to me and he says, you know, you've got to get your base saturations up to 6%. The first question that I have in my mind is, how do I do it? How do I do it? Because the soil's always going to occupy itself with these three cations in this order. Calcium being first, magnesium being second, potassium being third. So if there's an abundance of calcium, your soil's going to take it first. If there's more magnesium than there is calcium, it's going to take all of the magnesium. When you get to potassium, finally, it will take what it has available of that and will hold it. So my point is if you look at this graph here, I have 13.26 chairs occupied by calcium. I have 3.4 chairs occupied by magnesium. So if we did a little pie chart, I think it would look something like this is all that I had, and maybe it would look a little something like this for magnesium, right? And then everything else is going to be filled in with calcium. So the reason I share that is twofold. Is one, understand your base saturation. This is a very quick, simple, you can do this, you can calculate this at home. You take your base saturation percentage multiplied by your CECs. Think about it as a dinner table with your CEC representing how many chairs you have available, and really start to ask yourself, do I have the available exchange sites there to increase my potassium load? So what am I getting at? I'm getting at, if you had hydrogen or if you had sodium here, it would be a little easier for you to displace those, right? Those both being 1 plus charges, potassium being 1 plus charge, knowing that it would take calcium, magnesium, potassium first, and then it'll take these others, right? So we talked about that hydrogen occupies the space that calcium wants to. So let's just say, for example, that this was a 5% hydrogen and calcium would be a 73%. Really nothing to change there. No need to change the calcium. You have enough calcium. Your pH is probably not out of whack. And you might, in this instance, have the ability to put some potassium on and have the chance to hold it. But in the previous example, when this goes back to a 78, when this goes back to a 0, there's not a tremendous amount of available exchange sites for you to hold it. So how do I know this to be true? Well, I had a grower, and I hope that he watches this video, but I had a grower that I worked with in Western Illinois, West Central. He had soils in that 25 CEC range. He had mag levels that were anywhere from 22 to 26. They were a heavy, tight soil, right? One of the best things that he could do would be run drainage and then try to pour the calcium to it. However, he had heard some folks talking about, I got to get my base saturations to 6%, 7%, 8%, right? And so he did what I think any reasonable human being would do is that if I need to put more potassium on to increase my base sats, I'm going to put potash on, right? And so he'd been doing this. I didn't know any of this as a backstory. We started working together, and we did, through the 365 program, we took soils and tissues. He did 3 or 4 fields. I got a field back, and we're looking at the tissues, and he says, okay, well, what should I do? And I said, well, these other farms, everything's okay, but this one farm, you really need to address some potassium. And he was irate. He was just downright livid. And the reason being is that, and I didn't know this, is he said, for the last 3 years, I've put 500 pounds of potash on every year. So in 3 years, he'd put 1,500 pounds of potassium on. And that was the field that I told him through soil and tissue program that was struggling with K. He'd never had anybody take the time to explain base saturations, and that I don't care if you put 2,000 pounds of potassium on, you're not going to get a 1+ charge cation to displace a 2+ charge cation. So what am I getting at? I'm getting at, in those instances, moving your potash applications to in season might be one way for you to pick up not only some yield, but economic efficiencies. Don't think that you have to run the 310 pounds of potash that you maybe typically would with a removal rate or a 2-year spread. And we're going to talk about that a little more in detail, because I want to make sure that I give some detail about this soil test. I shared a little bit towards the tail end of what this program has been, and I want to put numbers to it. So what we're going to do is just give us a second to clean this board off. We're going to clean this board off, and we're going to put some numbers to what our fertility budget is. And when we talk about it at Biodyne and BW that we're not anti-fertilizer, we're just pro-farmer efficiency, we want to show you how we're accomplishing that.
Okay, so we got the board cleaned up from talking about the base saturations, and what we're going to do now is we're going to put some economic, so we're going to look at the economics of what we've been talking about here. So if you remember, we're going to continue talking about the same farm we have been, the same soil test that we've shown in the last episode and on this one. And so if you saw the episode before, we talked about this farm that is one of Bodie's family's farms, and their historical fertilizer program on this farm. And so what they had traditionally done for the last 5 years, based on what this indicator tests are telling them, their spread program has been no MAP or DAP, so no phosphate applied, and they're applying about 75 pounds of potash each year in season over the top. And so we wanted to kind of break down the economics with what fertilizer prices are doing now to kind of show you where we're at price-wise in that system. So what they had done previous to using the indicator test, where they've applied no MAP or DAP and only the 75 pounds of potash, was they had been traditionally operating on a 2-year removal spread. So say using tri-state Rex and removal values, which would have been about 185 pound of MAP and about 310 pound of potash for a 2-year spread. So every other year they would apply that 185 and 310. And so now we're at 0 and 75. So let's do that with today's dollars on our fertilizer prices. And so we're looking at, every place is a little bit different, but for those spring acres, we're hearing, $800 MAP per ton, $700 potash. So let's do the math on that, Bodie. What is 185 pound of MAP and 310 pound of potash cost us per acre?
So at $800 a ton MAP, that is 40 cents per pound of product, right? 40 cents per pound of product. Mm-hmm. So 185 times that, $74 an acre for a 2-year spread. Potash at 700 is going to be 35 cents a pound. So at 310, 0.35 times 310 is 108.50. So 108.50 per acre. So over here, that's been 0. Over here, we'll take that same 0.35 times 75. So 26.25. Now we need to multiply that by 2 to be equivalent to a 2-year spread, right? So 26 times 2 is going to be 52.50, I think. Yep. So times 2 equals 52.50 per acre. With our dry fertilizer budget, this would be 182.50. 182.50 per acre.
What's the difference
Maybe
between?
I should write that a little bit better there for those that can't see that. So that's $130.
Yep,
So
on the nose.
Net gain of 130. But we need to make sure that we back out the cost of our microbes.
Yep.
And so we've got meltdown and 401, call the combination $20.
Yep.
So less the $20 for meltdown 401. And we have a net gain equal to $110 per acre over a 2-year spread. Divide that back by 2, which would be the equivalent of $55 an acre per year.
So I think that this is huge. These numbers are huge. This is putting together what we've been talking about using these indicator soil tests. I think the thing that we should stress is we're not making a blanket recommendation for anybody to say, okay, use our microbes, spread 75 pound of potash, don't spread any MAP or DAP. There's a lot of farms that we're seeing that we can do this with, but this is not a blanket recommendation to cut these products out. We have to have the data, and we have to have, we feel like, Bodie and I talk about this all the time. We are both, classically trained, so to speak, with a standard soil test. And if someone hands us a standard soil test now, we're going to help them the best that we can. But that data is only so valuable because it doesn't tell us, it doesn't tell us our biological numbers. It doesn't give us true plant availability, or I guess true nutrient availability. And so, we realize that not everybody's going to run out to send samples to Next Level Ag to get the indicator test. But for us, the best method of gaining confidence that we can start doing some of these things is having those numbers. Now, we can get a base saturation from a lot of tests, and we can kind of get to that potash number from what we've done, from what we've just described. But when you get to that phosphate side, we really need to kind of see, what the numbers are and what we can make available to understand where we are, and then we can work on, cutting those rates or adjusting those phosphate rates based upon that.
So I think it's easy for us to tell you where it works, right? Like we can tell you where it works. The question is where do you break them? How do you break them, right? So I had a grower that he called in and he said, I've tried a lot of biological companies before and the product didn't work, right? So I'm thinking, okay, he's tried a lot of different biologicals, it didn't work. All right, so I'm thinking about this, right? And I asked him, I said, well, why do you think it doesn't work? Well, he has his opinions, right? And he said, well, I've seen what you guys are doing on Twitter, and I'm just really intrigued by yours. So it dawned on me, I asked him a question. I said, what's your pH? He said, well, I'm a 4.9 or a 5.0. And I politely said back to him, sir, the only biological you need is lime. Let's get that issue fixed first. And then let's look at adding the biology in. So what am I getting at? I'm getting at we know where our biology work really well as far as the soil pH goes. We know where they don't work well. And if you are a grower that has a 4.5 or a 4.9 or a 5 or a 5.1 or a 5.2, the first dollar that you should look at spending would be putting lime on.
Sure.
And I think that we both would agree with that.
Yeah.
I think our company stance would be the same way. We want you to have a great experience with our biology. We know where it works. We also know where it doesn't work. And so if you're a grower that is experiencing that side, put some lime on, get your pHs up, and then let's have a conversation about biology. Let's have a conversation about nutrient solubilization and nutrient availability, because as you've seen this, again, this is on our own farm. Our yields aren't going down. Our yields over the last 5 years have only gotten stronger from where they have been historically. Our soil test levels are not, which would be against common teaching. They're not going down. We're not pulling from the soil. We're actually making more nutrients available. Our soil tests continue to climb, and our yields continue to climb, all while we're saving $55 an acre a year or $110 an acre over a 2-year spread. And again, we're not anti-fertilizer. We're just pro-farm efficiency. And with prices where they're at today, the question is where do I invest my dollars, right? And where do I invest my dollars for the greatest return? And don't take just this one example, right? This is an example that I have data. You've seen the data now. Another example that I would give before I would leave you with is with this. We had a grower in northwest Iowa who had a 260-acre field, and he has not put any MAP on in 6 years. He's been on the Meltdown 401 program for that 6 years. We've seen the same thing in his soils. Now, I know a lot of people say, well, that's northwest Iowa, right? Their soils are way better than what mine are, but we had seen the same thing. He's in an elevated pH area. They're going to be in that 6.9 to 7.4 range. Sometimes they get up as high as 7.8. Anyways, he was around the 7.2 area on this particular field. Phosphate numbers continued to climb on soil availability. Potassium levels were starting to get a little bit stronger as well. Not applying commercial fertilizer. This year, the grower added no MAP again, so this would be year 7. And he had 110 pounds of potassium through a top dress application as well as a Y drop 0013. And that grower had a 302 bushel average across the 260 acre field. I guess I share that not as any sort of a brag. I share that simply because that's a completely different environment. Weather related, it's a completely different environment. Soil from Indiana, this is a 17 CEC, that's a 33, 34 CEC, so double, as far as the holding capacity. But seeing, 302 bushels across the 260 acre field is pretty fascinating. So we've given you a couple things, and I don't know whether you've picked up on them or not. I would say stay tuned for the next week because I think you're going to be interested. We've talked a lot about phosphorus. We've hinted around a little bit about potassium. You might be asking yourself right now, well, what does potassium have anything to do with biology?
Right. Well, and I'm going to throw one more thing in, Bodie, because we've got to throw our salesman hat on at some point in time, right? And so we've talked about this. We've got this up here. We've got it written right here. Okay, the main thing that I want to stress before we close out of this video is we can do this. We gain the confidence to do this because of this. All right, we've all seen on social media someone talks about a neighbor that they had that never spread fertilizer and he mined his soils, right? And we probably can all find an example in our neighborhood of that. That is right here is the difference. Okay, I think I can't stress enough that biology making phosphorus more available. Maybe what Bodie's leading into, maybe we're making potassium more available, but our biology is what's making that click. And if we don't apply the biology and we just decide we're not going to spread fertilizer to save money, we absolutely can see the potential for mining soils.
Agreed 100%.
So with that, we'll see you next episode.
So the last episode, we went from base saturations to working through the economics. And if you guys are anything like me, you're probably wondering, how do you have the confidence, right? How do you have the confidence to talk to a grower and say, yeah, you can potentially cut all of your phosphate out. You could potentially cut 150 pounds of your potash out. How do you do that? And I think the answer is simple, because, and you have to go back to week 1, right? You got to go all the way back to week 1, and the answer lies in there. Because of being vertically integrated, that word is usually used to talk about in business. where nobody can disrupt us, right? If you're vertically integrated, we don't got to worry about the supply chain of these outside influencing factors. They don't worry about it. When we talk about being vertically integrated, we talk about it from this standpoint. We talk about it because we feel like we're fairly intimate with our microbes, for lack of a better word. From isolation to fermentation to formulation, it's all done in-house. So we know what these microbes are, and we know what their capabilities are. So when we come to you, or when one of our BW reps, one of our grower dealers comes to you, they're working off this same information, right? They're looking at, this is what we would call a capability chart. So this is a 401 capability chart, and it's basically telling you what the microbes are. They're numbered on the left-hand side, and what are their capabilities, right? So everything on the left-hand side is a remediation aspect. Mm-hmm. So there is some sort of remediation that is happening in the soil with the 401, which only makes sense, right? Because after all, Dr. Farley, who is a PhD microbiologist and plant physiologist, he wasn't focused on that to start with, right? He was focused on remediating soils, the petroleum hydrocarbons. Mm-hmm. So it only makes sense that he brings microbes with those capabilities. And so for those of you that maybe don't understand what that is they have the ability to turn in a negative, like a benzene, a toluene, an ethylene or ethylbenzene, naphthalene, paraffin, right? All of those things, they have the ability to convert them as a food source. Mm-hmm. So they can turn that in and use a negative, right? That would be a hydrocarbon, would be a negative thing in the soil. However, those microbes have the ability to turn them in as a food source and use them to give you phosphorus, right, or nitrogen, or all of these things, whether it be iron or sulfur, mm-hmm. A whole gamut of things. So when we talk to you about that, that's really where this is coming from.
Yeah. I mean, that's a great point, because we're breaking those hydrocarbons down on the left side and making simple carbons out of it, food source. And then on the right side, we've got, like you say, phosphorus solubilizers, N2 fixers, diazotrophs, ammonification. Excuse me, I can't spit it out. Ammonifying bacteria. So there's a plethora of what our strains of biology are doing in that 401 product.
So you move over to 501, and so maybe, as we start to shift a little bit more away from the agronomy and more into the products, maybe we should take a little bit of time. And so Sean, let's go back, and we look at 401. Explain where or all of the applications that 401 could be used in, and product names that maybe don't necessarily say 401 but have 401 microbes in them.
I think that's a great point, Bodie, because 401 is the team technology, and so that is the foundation of several products. And the reason being is 401 is a product that we like in furrow. It's kind of has its best fit as an in-furrow application. And we know that, I don't know what the percentage is, but there's a large percentage of farmers that don't and don't have a plan to, at any, in the near future, to add an in-furrow liquid system to their planter, right? And so, with that being said, we want them to be able to use this technology. And so 401, you're going to see that product as 401. You would see that product as Environoc ST, which is a concentrated version of 401 that can be an overtreat for seed treatment, or it could be a foundational piece of a seed treatment if you're, in the seed treating business. There's Biocast. There's Biocast Plus, which is a combination of 401 and the 501 or meltdown technology. So that's the ways you're going to find, most predominantly going to find the 401 is, and the Biocast is the reason why it's not just called 401 is Biocast is 401 plus organic acids and a food source. And so it has a food source in it to sustain that biology until, it gets into the soil and starts doing its work. We use that product foliarly a lot. It also gets used in furrow some, but it's typically would be a kind of a foliar product. Biocast Plus, again, that's a product that is Biocast, which is the 401 plus a food source, plus we add in the 501 technology, which is kind of known as our meltdown product. And that's a product for someone that maybe doesn't have the in-furrow capability and also doesn't want to make a separate trip, whether that's fall or in the spring with a burn down to apply that meltdown, they can get that product already pre-mixed and apply that product together.
So can't forget about Entrust.
Entrust, great
Relatively
example.
new product. The 401 team is in there that we use that as a biological nitrogen management piece. Had some data that came off 53 or 4 locations last year, all across the U.S., the upper Midwest, North Carolina, really to the Dakotas. Had some really strong trials against your Instincts and Centuros and things like that.
And it's not a nitrification inhibitor, or it's not a
Nope, it's
like those products.
Simply using microbes to consume, convert, and release nitrogen at a later date, rather than to kill off your nitrifying bacteria that would convert it and release it. Biocast also can be used in a pre-plant or post-emerge broadcast application. So that's where the biocast came from. I'm thinking of broadcast. But yeah, well, we got 401 is in some advanced too.
That's right.
So we talked a little bit about 501. You heard Sean reference 501 or Meltdown, and at this point, if you're searching us online, if you're looking at our catalog online, you know, you might open it up and be like, gosh darn, there's 50 products here. Where do I start? You know, how do I make sense of it all? Really, that's what we want to make this simple, right? So 401 is the base team of plant growth promoting microbes. 501 is the team that was originally designed for cellulose, lignin, chitin. So think about residue degradation. That's what it was originally designed for. So 501 and 401 are the base teams, and then those products then go off into other products. So 501 gets blended with organic acids, creates Meltdown. 501 and 401, thing to note, both OMRI approved. Meltdown is not, simply because of the organic acids that are used in it. Biocast Plus, as Sean referenced earlier, which is Biocast Plus 501. So again, this is just maybe expanding a little bit, if you will, on our confidence level, right? You know, we talked about, or I asked the question to start this off is, how do you feel confident, right? I mean, you were on the other side. You got sucked into the snake oil lifestyle by me.
Right.
You know, how do we have the confidence to be able to talk about, you know, reduction of fertilizer? And really, if you think about it back to when I started here, you know, I kind of think about it. You know, when I told the owners that the condition that I had to come and work here was that I wanted to bring 365. I wanted to bring soils and tissues to understand what our products were doing. If I was going to come and work here, and they didn't flinch, right? And I thought, for me, that was extremely impactful. You know, we're dealing in what many call snake oils or foo-foo juice or however other many names that they have for it, but they were willing to step out and to take the steps to prove what their microbes are doing. And again, they have the confidence because of the bench level, because of the capability testing that we just showed, but this is just to simplify, right? Don't get caught up in the names of the microbes, right? There's some really long ones. This is the part that really matters. So when we talk about a diazotroph, what is a diazotroph, Sean?
It fixes nitrogen from the nitrogen in the air. I mean,
so almost like soybeans?
Very much like soybeans. So it pulls the nitrogen that's in the air, pulls it into the soil, and converts that into inorganic N for the plant to then utilize.
And so you're saying that the 401 microbes contain some diazotrophs?
Sure does. Matter of fact, it contains quite a few of them, to be completely honest. And not just in quantity, but in the number of different strains of biology within that product that are diazotrophic.
So ammonifying microbes, I heard you talk about that one a little bit earlier, and you also referenced something off of a soil test. So you said something about ammonifying microbes. You said there was something on a soil test you were looking at. What is that?
So when we did the video about where we were first looking at the soil test, and we got into that a little bit of a nitrogen discussion, kind of got off the rails a little bit talking about what we were learning from that soil test. I talked about inorganic nitrogen and organic nitrogen, and that's what these ammonifying microbes do. They convert that in that's not plant available, but it's in the soil, and make that plant available. And so we have a couple dozen ammonifying microbes between the 401, 501 combination to be able to do that, to convert that in that's there and make it available to the plant.
Huh. And we've obviously we've been no stranger talking about phosphorus. So what do we have that addresses those?
We've got phosphate or phosphorus solubilizing microbes. I think 401 by itself has 5 phosphorus solubilizing microbes. And so where Bodie's talked about on his farm, where they're utilizing, and he talked about the farm in Iowa that had the 300 bushel average or 302 bushel average corn this year, utilizing these products, they are making more phosphorus available and raising the soil test, and at the same time, they haven't been using traditional MAP or DAP.
So, and then we just talked about 501, we talked about the degradation, the cellulose, lignin, chitin, starch, waxes, oils, right? We talked about that, taking complex carbons, making them available. They also have the bioremediation side. We've got petroleum hydrocarbon, pesticides and herbicides. What's Sideriphore?
Sideriphores are, what we've got on here is iron magnets, okay? And so these make more iron available in the soil. And so what you saw, we talked about this on the soil test that you had, right?
Yep.
Iron is one that as we go through the season tends to get locked away and we don't have a lot of access to iron. And so we saw from the soil test, when you have a high phosphorus solubility, which is good, it means your phosphorus isn't locked away. But we can also see times where iron's a little bit low, and believe it or not, it's a required element to grow a crop.
Well, that makes sense because as I work with growers out in Iowa, they got some of those high pH environments where they actually have IDC,
iron deficiency chlorosis.
Yeah,
that's right.
And I've had growers report back, where we used our biology, we used seed treatment followed by biocast. We didn't see the IDC, and guys were typically spraying soy green, could be upwards of $20 an acre just in that product. So I guess that was interesting to see, firsthand experience from growers. Nodulating. So, wait a second. So you're telling me that we got bacteria in there that are going to help with nodules?
Yeah, especially the 401 team. So the biocast and the 401, they have some nodulating bacteria there. And so if you're going into where you start hearing about utilizing some nodulating bacteria is, if you haven't grown soybeans for a long period of time, and you need to inoculate those beans. Well, we don't really need to do that because 401 has that. Another thing is you're seeing a lot of guys as they begin to push for higher yields. We've played with nitrogen applications and we kind of know where we are there. But there are folks as they get into higher yield environments are choosing to re-inoculate maybe beans every year to try to make sure that there's plenty of nitrogen fixation going on there. And so we've got ammonifying bacteria, so we're making some nitrogen available, and we've got N2 fixing if you use that, and plus we have the nitrogen fixing relationship to add those rhizobia and get those going and get nodulation on our soybeans as well, or something like that.
So when that 401 capability chart came up, you mentioned earlier that 401 could be put in furrow, it could be put in biocast for broadcast, it could go biocast plus, it could go within trust, it's an advanced. But you said something about Environoc ST. Mm-hmm. And then I just heard you talking about the fact that we have nodulating. So is Environoc ST different than everything else? Or are you telling me that I get nodulating bacteria with Environoc ST plus everything else? I get the phosphate solubilizers, the ammonifiers, the diazotrophs. I get ones that produce hormones, rooting hormones. I get all of that?
It's all there. Yeah, it's all there. Plus, we've got some research data, and we can throw this behind us when we, with this as well, where we have cold germ tests and worm germ tests and that sort of stuff where we've tested ST over-treated on a popular seed treatment versus ST on naked seed versus naked seed. And it's amazing to see what we see in cold germ scores by having ST on there. So I'm going to say anecdotally, I don't know that we have a ton of data right now that says if you use ST, it will aid your fungicide issue, the fungicide that's maybe on your treatment. But it does seem that our beneficial bacteria and fungi may be out-competing some of the negatives that are out there that we see when soils are cold and wet early in the spring.
Also, as I look down here, I see ethylene reduction capabilities, right? So ACC deaminase, which is a precursor to ethylene. And what that is, and I guess I've had a lot of people, have described to me is when I use 401, the first thing that I go do is I go dig roots because I can see that, right? And we think about ethylene and we talk about ethylene, but I think we think about it more with fungicides late season. We know that if a plant goes under any sort of biotic or abiotic stress, that plant releases ethylene and it starts to shut down, which is where a fungicide comes in and we spray a fungicide and we block that ethylene or we inhibit the ethylene and we keep those plants with some stay green or we keep them alive. And I just wonder, with the ACC deaminase or reducing ethylene, right? We think about planting corn into 45 degrees or 50 degrees, or maybe we plant it into 55, but we get a cold spell that goes down to 35 or 40. That would be a abiotic stress event, right?
It is, and what I think is kind of interesting about this is we think about ethylene and we think about when it's hot and dry and our corn plants are rolled up and they look like pineapples, right? And we've seen some stress mitigation from our biology at reducing that when we're hot and dry. But what you're talking about is when you're cold and wet early and you're getting that abiotic stress, and you'll have ethylene happen in those situations too, and that's that plant stressing as it's trying to grow. If we can block that out and we can keep those roots going in those less than ideal conditions, it helps us to power through some of those tough times.
Makes sense with what guys are seeing, what guys are sharing. I see there's a couple things highlighted at the bottom. We've talked a lot about phosphorus. We've talked a fair amount about nitrogen, and we've hinted about potassium. And I think that one's a little bit interesting. It was actually, again, go back to being vertically integrated. The benefits of it for you guys as our customers is we were actually doing an internal webinar and we were sharing the data. And I know that if you guys have followed on Twitter, either Sean or I or Biodyne Agronomy or BW Fusion, you probably have seen something about a trial booklet coming out. And that's probably what you're waiting on, right? You're probably like, all right, just shut up already, quit talking and let me see the data. We have seen now in a 3-year study that potassium levels behind the Meltdown 401 combination is significant. I would call it significant.
I think it's huge, yeah. And we've talked about it in a couple other videos too, as we've talked about potassium. We've kind of alluded to it. And so we are, actively looking at that, trying to get data. Our yield data and our tissue data and our soil data says that we have more phosphorus available when we utilize our 401s and our meltdowns or our 501 team. We are trying to get to the bottom of that and trying to understand like phosphorus solubilizing bacteria and understand what our current strains of biology are doing on the potassium side. So
the thing that I think is interesting, or the thing that maybe makes us a little bit unique is as soon as that webinar is done, one of our research guys, Lane, down at the lab in Sarasota, goes right to developing a medium or an agar to test and see whether we have any potassium solubilizing bacteria in our strains. And I can't let the cat out of the bag completely, but I'll give you a little bit of a hint, and the answer is yes. How many? You'll have to stay tuned for that. But that's another benefit of being a family-owned, family-run company, that we're focused on continually understanding what our microbes are, what our capabilities are, what they can do, what they can't do. And that gives us, Sean and I, sitting here in front of you today, the information to talk about things that we know, things that we can definitively prove, and that we're just not going to grab these things. So whether it's Sean or I that you have a conversation with, whether it's any one of our reps across the U.S., we're all going to lean back on this same thing. If you want to talk about diazotrophs, let's have the conversation.
Sure.
You want to talk about ammonifying microbes, we'll talk about them too. Phosphorus, no problem. We're going to talk about sulfur. We're going to talk about potassium. We've seen some interesting things with boron that we're going to talk about as well. I think it's just fascinating. And in a world of uncertain times as far as fertilizer prices go, if you can invest in microbes that are taking locked up mineral nutrition that is not available, and you can make it more plant available, those products probably pay for themselves before the combine ever gets to the field.
Yeah, I think that, our measurement stick or our yardstick that we use, in agriculture is yield at the end of the day. And I think that's great. I think these products have been, 401 especially, at least a decade or coming on a decade of
Yep.
widespread use in ag. They've got yield data. We've got pictures. We've got, yield data. What we've been able to do with 365, and like you say, with the guys in the lab, with the vertical integration, is understanding what is in these products, understanding the biology, and understanding what they bring to the table. And so as we continue to go, just like you said, obviously yield's important, but the metric that we're looking at is just like what we described in the last video on the whiteboard, where we're looking at the economics of it. If we can confidently reduce your fertilizer investment using our biology, then we don't need the yield yardstick per se, because we're doing it in upfront input costs. Okay, hey, we're back again. Bodie and I are back, and we've talked, we've done enough of these, a fair amount of these videos now, Bodie, but we're going to dive in a little bit deeper, and we're going to talk a little bit more specifically about some of the data with our products, and kind of more specifically phosphorus.
Well, those at home are probably saying it's about dang time you got to the data.
So kicking off here, so we like to throw this out there. I think this is a neat chart. This is Liebig's law of the minimum, and basically what it is that yield. It says yield is proportional to the amount of the most limiting nutrient. So that could be any nutrient out there. If that nutrient is limiting, then your yield is going to be only as good as what you can gain up to the point where that nutrient limits your yield. This also could be things like biotic and abiotic stresses, which are living and non-living stresses. So an abiotic stress may be something like compaction, or it may be a misadjusted planter or something like that. Whereas a biotic stress is going to be any stress that is biological in nature, so anything that could be of living. And so this to me is kind of the foundation piece of what Biodyne and BW Fusion's biology was built upon, right? So we have living, breathing biology. And so if our biology doesn't change the biological respiration score of the soil, then that's not going to give you a lot of confidence that our biology is doing what we want it to do. And so if you remember from the video we did where we were talking about the different soil tests and all the different values on that indicator soil test, this is the value at the very top on the right-hand side of that soil test. It's the HT3 value that is giving us a 24-hour measurement of CO2 release in the soil, okay? And so what you're seeing here, blue bars would be treated, and treated in this case is 401 plus meltdown. Spring-applied 401, spring-applied meltdown, compared to an untreated trial. And so what I really love about this graph, this is the compilation of all of our research trials from 2021 in Iowa. And what we see right off the bat is they took a soil sample, they took an indicator test before they made any applications, so before the meltdown, before the 401, and we see that the untreated area actually had more biological respiration than where they took where the treated area was. So after those treatments were made, the corn goes to V4, and suddenly we see 100% swing in biological respiration, and what that means is the respiration at V4 on the treated side is 2 times basically what it is on the untreated side. And we carry a huge advantage in biological respiration all the way out through R3. So what this tells me, this gives me confidence that our biology are alive and they're multiplying and they're doing what they're supposed to be doing. But not only that, this isn't short term. This is all the way out through the growing season, all the way through R3. We're still seeing a significant advantage to biological respiration with our products.
So we've talked about it now an awful lot. There's an initiative that Gil, one of the owners, is very passionate about. You're going to hear about that in a little bit. But we want to make sure that you understand this. We talk about that we're an education company, and really, our success comes from not hiding. We want to be transparent in data, transparent in what our microbes are, what they aren't, and understanding, for you guys to have a basic understanding of what the microbes are doing. So this might be a little bit of remediation, if you will. But bacteria that convert organic P to inorganic P are called phosphorus solubilizers. And those are bacteria that produce enzymes that break free organic phosphorus that's complexed or not plant available, making it plant available.
So that initiative that Bodie mentioned is called Free the P. That's kind of our thing, is we want to make phosphorus that's not available to the plant, make that available. And so this is what I love about the transparency of our company is, here's the deal. 401 has 5 phosphorus solubilizers in it. 501 or the meltdown, when you use those together, that has 2 phosphorus solubilizers in it. So we're coming to the field with a multifaceted approach of getting phosphorus released and making it available to the plant. So here's some data looking at 401 meltdown of inorganic phosphorus. And so this is just a trial of treated, untreated, 401 and meltdown. We're not looking at the organic side here. We're just looking at the amount of inorganic phosphorus available. And so what we see right off the bat is we see about a 19% increase in inorganic phosphorus in the treated versus the untreated. At V12, we've got about 8%. And again, this is what I talked about with the respiration chart that we showed a couple slides back. At R3, 109% more inorganic phosphorus available to the plant than with the untreated. And so these biology are working season long throughout the season. And the thing that I really am amazed by with especially with this data at R3 is I think about phosphorus as something that we really need in the plant early. And I think about something that we really want to utilize, especially in corn, as we're in grain fill, if we're packing in starches into that, because kernel weight is so incredibly important to yield that we're making more phosphorus available deep into the grain field period, and that's how we're adding and aiding and getting heavier kernel weights, which in my opinion lead to higher yields.
So as I look at this data, I think there's a couple things that are interesting. One, Sean just mentioned, V12 usually lines up with about 1,000 GDUs, give or take. If you look at the grand growth curve or the grand uptake or the massive uptake of nutrition, 1,000 GDUs is kind of that key target area. Mm-hmm. And what's encouraging about this is to know that those microbes are working at or before early season, like Sean talked about, but also where it really matters, late season, 1,000 GDUs and beyond.
Right.
We've got a massive difference. The other thing to note about this is that this is not measuring uptake. This is not taking uptake into account. This is just looking at plant available phosphorus, right? Plant available, inorganic P is plant available phosphorus, treated versus untreated. So here's a study. This is the first year in 2019 of a 3-year study. So you can see on the left, rainfall was 5 to 8 inches above the 10-year average. 2019, we're looking at phosphorus on the left. On the right, we're looking at 2020. Now, the interesting thing about 19 versus 20 is 5 to 8 inches over their average of water in 19. We know that the only thing that remains the same in agriculture year over year is that everything's different.
That's right.
That couldn't be proved out more to be fact than look at 2020 in Iowa. If you go there, they were 14 inches behind their 10-year average. So we went from a surplus to a deficit, and we got there in a hurry. Mm-hmm. the thing that's interesting is that in 2019, when we would sit here and say, you know, we had conditions that were ideal, right? We know that microbes need moisture to remain active and to stay active. You can see that. I mean, you look at the month 1, month 2, month 3, and month 4, there's a significant advantage that the Meltdown 401 combo is bringing over the untreated or the grower standard. Move to 2020, while the levels may not be as high, that is arguably because, well, we just didn't have the moisture for it to work.
Right.
There still is an advantage through the Meltdown 401 combination. And for me, that's where all of this becomes real. Again, this is part of a 3-year study, so you're going to get to see some 2021 data. You have started to see some 2021 data as well, but you can see the advantage. When we talk about phosphorus, we talk about it fairly confidently because we have data like this, data like the farm that we referenced earlier that went 302 across 260 across the farm on my own home farm. You know, we have a lot of data that shows that, you know, we're pretty good at freeing the P.
Yep.
So this is another one. So this is the one with the 3-year study, and this is 2021 data looking at inorganic phosphorus. So you can see that the blue bar is 401, the orange bar is Meltdown, the gray bar is Meltdown 401, and the yellow bar is untreated. And you can see the nutrient availability that is coming from each one of those segments. So the thing that's interesting is now you're looking at 3 years of 401 only being in the blue bar, the yellow bar, the gold bar being the grower standard, the Meltdown being the orange bar for 3 years now, and the orange or the gray bar being Meltdown and 401 for 3 years. And you can see the nutrient availability. Look at R3 again and just look how it runs away. 114 pounds to the Meltdown 401 versus 45 on the grower standard. Fairly impressive.
Super impressive.
We're back for more. We've covered a wide variety of topics. Just finished up phosphorus, going to dive right into potassium here. So this is again a trial that we're looking at, blue bar being untreated, the orange bar being Meltdown 401. This is looking at soil availability. This is not tissues. This is soil availability, simply looking at the available amount of the specific nutrient. In this case, we're looking at potassium. So 2019, thing just like phosphorus to note, rainfall was 5 to 8 inches above the 10-year average. In 2020, 14 inches below the 10-year average. As we move over to 2019, you can see the advantage. We look at month 4 and you're about 275 pounds of potassium in the Meltdown 401 combo, and you're about 180. So 95 pounds at what would be about R3. Move over to 2020, and again, this is in one of their worst droughts that they've had. They ended up being 17.3 inches behind their 10-year average. You look at month 1, look at month 2, look at month 3, and the thing that is fascinating here is in 2019, when Mother Nature is working with you, right? You got constant moisture that's making potassium available. We know how important moisture is to potassium availability, don't we, Sean?
That's right.
It's still amazing to me to see the fact that where we combine Meltdown and 401, we're bringing more potassium availability than the untreated in what many would call a perfect year of potassium availability. Shift over to 2020, and that spread just significantly widens. this is really what has probably put us on alert, I would say, as a company the last really, 45 days, maybe 60 days, as far as trying to dig in and get some answers behind us. Why are we seeing this? And again, so 2019 would have been the start of this. 2020 would have been year 2. 2021 would be year 3 of the data. So what you're looking at, and thing to note is that year 1, the blue bar is the grower standard, right? Well, year 2 is still the grower standard of 2 years, but on the 2020 data, that's 2 years of Meltdown and 401 being combined. The reason I bring that up is there's a lot of people that have asked the question, well, if I use your biologicals one time, right, I'm not going to see a response from it the second year, right? Or I'm not going to see a response the third year. I only got to use it one time. And, really, before this data and before some of the data that our growers are sharing that have been on the system for 6 years, you kind of just sound like a sales guy, right? Like, well, no, not at all. You got to keep using them every year. But what we have seen is that there's actually a significant, stair step, I guess, for lack of a better word.
Yeah.
It seems that things only get better. We had a dealer meeting that we had 37 dealers from Indiana, north central Indiana, Ohio, and a couple out of Michigan. And it was interesting that one of the dealers came up to me at the meeting and he says, this is my 3rd year of using Meltdown and 401. And he says, when I walk across my fields, they feel different.
Sure.
They just feel different. And that is something that does get talked about. We might have some ideas on why that might be. But I think it's fascinating to see that through the use of beneficial microbes and really pairing Meltdown as the foundation, 401 on top of that we see nutrient solubilization only get better with time.
Yeah, I really feel like we're changing the soil as we use these products, year after year, especially where we have trials that we've done the same thing over and over. And I think that last slide that you showed is impressive with 2020 being as dry as it was. When you think about potassium, and so we kind of go back to what we've talked about previously, like on a soil test, and potassium is known to get locked between clay layers, and so as that ground shrinks, if the potassium's in the middle and we go into a drought year like they had in 2020, it gets locked in there like this. And so for that to happen, and you still see that much of a significant difference in the amount of K that's available as compared to the untreated, it's really impressive what these biology are doing, what they sure appear to be doing to making K more available. And so this is the 3rd year of that trial. This is the 21. So we just showed you 19 and 20. We've showed it for phosphorus. This is what it is for potassium. And it follows the same suit where we see the untreated is the yellow bar, blue is 401 by itself, orange is Meltdown by itself, and the gray is the combination of the two. What we see here is, especially when it comes to K, that I think on the previous one with phosphorus, we really saw some huge advantages of Meltdown. We saw big advantages of 401 compared to the untreated, but Meltdown was just really, really lights out there. Well, here what we see is that combination of the two products making more K available, and it's significant all the way out through R3, where we're trying to finish that crop out. And you think about that, what is K a big constant? It constitutes a lot of our stock and standability and those types of things. And you see a year where, especially a year like 21, in some parts where guys had some really, really good crop, we utilized everything that plant had to give. If we've got that much available K, then we really have a potential to improve our standability and do some of those things with it as well.
We obviously know that we broke down what a diazotroph is, what a monifying bacteria is, what phosphate solubilizers are, those that release hormones, those that release ACC deaminase, a precursor to ethylene. We've seen all of those things. And now we just unpacked a whole lot of data talking about potassium, but we really haven't talked a whole lot about potassium from a microbial side of things. And we're going to go to a research paper, and I would challenge you to look this up for yourself. But potassium is one of the major macronutrients which play an important role in plant growth and development. Things that I think that we both agree with, that most everybody would agree with. Total soil potassium reserves are generally large. However, a large portion of it exists in insoluble K minerals. So insoluble means that it's not plant available. And very little potassium becomes available to plant. There are certain microorganisms which use a number of biological processes to make potassium available from unavailable forms. Is that saying what I think it's saying?
I think it's saying that biology makes K available.
These potassium solubilizing bacteria, known as KSBs, can be used as a promising approach to increase potassium availability in soils, thus playing an important role for crop establishment under K-limited soils. Owing to natural available source of potassium in soil and high price of synthetic potassium fertilizers, which you growers know all about that, the importance of KSB is increasing day by day. The use of chemical fertilizers can be decreased by using KSB in agriculture that can lead to sustainable agriculture. Now I got to stop for a second because sustainable agriculture is a word that I've heard probably 1,000 times. It's probably not going away, is it, Sean?
No, that's something that's it's a buzzword today. Sustainable.
A number of workers have demonstrated the role of KSB, or potassium solubilizing bacteria, in crop improvement. The present review highlights the importance of KSB for enhancing crop production. The mechanisms used by KSB for K solubilization have been discussed. The work of various scientists regarding plant growth promotion through KSB is reviewed in detail and has also been discussed. What I think is fascinating here is that there's research papers to prove out that maybe biology is extremely important. When we think about you unpacking that soil sample and we think about making recommendations for our soils of $200 or $300 per acre off of just the chemical component, what have we been missing for all of these years?
We don't talk about biology.
And the question that I have to ask, like this is a legit question that I have to ask is, which industry really is snake oil now?
That's a great question.
You know, I think for years, because the biological sector has been, a misnomer, has been maybe unknown, hasn't had a lot of people diving into it, that it's easy to throw sticks at it, right?
Well, let's unpack that a little bit, right? So we went to the whiteboard and we talked about recommendations for spreading, hundreds and 500 and 600 pounds of potash. I believe that the dinner table drawing that we put up there kind of disproves any ability of that to work.
You make a valid point. And also, didn't the University of Illinois do a potassium paradox study that they published?
Oh
that
boy, you're going to get darts now, Bodie Kitchel.
20-some years of corn with no potassium applied, and they saw that potassium levels actually increased in the soil.
Yeah.
The only reason that I share this is to challenge you to maybe think differently than the way that you've thought for years. The definition of insanity is doing the same thing over and over and expecting a different outcome, right?
That's right.
And one saying that I really like to say is that, we can't do what we've always done because we're going to get what we've always got.
That's right.
And if we think about, you referenced the whiteboard, right? We think about the dollars that are at stake today from what 185 pounds of MAP costs, what 310 pounds of potash costs. And you think of what the alternative is, using a meltdown 401 and looking at the cost of that. Economics are going to play a huge role in this. If it's not economics that are the most important to you, regulations probably are coming right behind them.
Sure. And that looks to be what's happening. And you've said this, you said it in another video. Economics, logistics,
And agronomics.
And we don't, economics have to be important. We can't but that can't be the only thing.
No.
You can't just say, okay, well, I can't afford to do this, and I throw it out and I don't use anything. We're showing that we can use less, but we can't just walk away from the fertilizer if we're not doing some other things to try to make the biological side better.
So it's interesting because as I unpacked this, right, I think it makes sense why we talk about 365 so much, right? Why we talk about the importance to us in our roles to be able to have the conversations with growers across the entire U.S., working in wheat in Kansas and Oklahoma with guys we get to work with, potatoes in Idaho, right? Those soils are different. Those environments are different. But when we have soils and tissues and we're taking treated and untreated, we're understanding how our microbes are working across a lot of different soils, a lot of different environments. And it's pretty cool to read research papers like this that support the things that we're seeing. And to know that we've got a research team, a scientific team down in Florida that is continually working to develop and find and isolate the new microbes. Some could argue that biodyne's been very successful for what they've done for the last 9 years. So why make any changes?
Right.
Why add new strains of microbes in? Why change anything that you've done? Why go searching for other things that your microbes might be doing? And I think that in a nutshell is really who we are. Is we want to know everything that we can possibly know about our microbes, so that we can have a conversation with you and really focus and hone in on the efficiency side of your operation.
Well, success, what's success? If you have a seed corn hybrid at a trial, what do you expect? What's the success rate to make you successful? 60%? 65%?
Beauty's the eye of the beholder.
Right. I mean, and so what we try to do with 365 and what the guys at the lab are doing is nothing works all the time, but we're trying to understand and pinpoint the things where we weren't successful so that we could be successful in those areas and understand, what the limitation was. That's what it's about. We're not here to just, here's some biology, tell us what the yield is at the end of the year. We are here to walk through this throughout the season and in the off season, and we want to put our products in the best chance of success.
Couldn't say it better.
Okay, everybody, we're back. We've talked about, what have we talked about? We've talked about soil tests, we've talked about our biology, we've talked about
Base
phosphorus,
saturations.
base saturations, phosphorus, potassium,
Economics.
data, economics. We're running the gamut. And so
Are we not done yet?
we're getting close, but I still got a lot of things I want to talk about, Bodie. So what about nitrogen? Let's talk about bacteria that convert organic N to inorganic N are called ammonifiers. So these are microbes that convert organic N to inorganic N through an ammonification process. Organic N is that nitrogen which is not plant available. We've talked about this a little bit.
Yep.
And once converted by the ammonifiers is released as ammonium.
So that would be WEON on the soil test, right?
That's right.
WEON, if you remember that from the soil test, that's what that measurement is, organic nitrogen, right?
So the holy grail of agriculture to me is nitrogen, right? That's the one thing
For
that
sure.
everybody wants to try to master, and it's slippery, okay? Every time you think you're getting close, the more we learn, the less we know, right? So this is what I love about these products. How many ammonifiers are in 401 and 501? And we're not afraid to talk about this. We have 28 strains of ammonifying bacteria between the two products. And so we have 20 that overlap that are in both. Each product has 4 unique strains as well. And so when we put those two together, we have the ability to take organic nitrogen and make it plant available.
So this
I
is
think that's
different,
huge.
right? This is different than what a diazotroph that you referenced earlier?
Right. So I referenced a diazotroph, and we'll get to that here in a couple slides, but this is just taking nitrogen that's already there.
So this is pulling from a different pool
This is a
of
different
nitrogen.
pool of nitrogen. This is nitrogen, especially in, say, a manure, an area with manure history, where you may have a lot of organic N that's not been plant available. It's there, all right? Instead of spending more money applying more synthetic nitrogen, let's use what we've got there, and then, then we can utilize the diazotrophs, or we can utilize our synthetic N to get us where we need to go.
Makes sense.
So a 401 401 meltdown inorganic N 2021. So right at the beginning, treated, untreated, and before any applications were made, we had more N in the treated area, right? And so When we look at it at V4, we've got about 42% more in at V4. We've got about 12.5% more at V12. We've got 12% more at R3. So again, we've talked about this with P. We've talked about this with K. Our biology is working throughout the growing season. What it basically means is when I said we've got 42% more at V4, what that really means is we've got about 32.5% increase in inorganic N at V4 over the pre-sample. So what that says is, yeah, we had an advantage already at the beginning with pre. And so it was actually, when we take into account that advantage was there, we were still 30% more inorganic N at V4. So as soon as that biology goes in the soil, it goes to work. By the time we get to R3, we still 10% more inorganic N throughout R3. And like you mentioned earlier, this doesn't take into account what the plant's taking up. This is throughout the growing season, and the plant's sucking that nitrogen out of the ground like a straw throughout the entire time, and those biology are still converting that in and making more of it available.
So if you go back there, is it safe to assume that if there was a yield advantage, right? If there was something, we talked about Liebig's law of the minimum, that you're only as good as what your lowest limiting factor is, right?
Sure.
But so is it safe to say, and again, you said that this does not account for any sort of uptake, this is just looking at soil availability. If I had more yield, and we believe a lot of what research is done, and they say, 1.1 to 1.2. Now, we're not talking about applied nitrogen, right? We're talking about 1.1 to 1.2 pounds of N per bushel of grain, right, created. So if I had a 15 bushel advantage early on, right? Because those plants they know if they're carrying an advantage. Would it be safe to say that, there's like a 30-pound advantage to our Meltdown 401? If I look at 44.5 pounds versus 31.5, I look at a 15 bushel advantage times 1.2. Are we getting close to 30-pound advantage with this?
I think we're getting there. I think that that's absolutely possible. When you see numbers like that, and if that's what your outcome is, then you can make that assumption. The issue is that you can have this and have a different yield number, right? So we don't know how much nitrogen we're making available because that's determined by the pool of nitrogen that's there. So it's hard to just say that we get X if we do Y, right? Or if we do Y, we get X. However, if we have 10 pounds of organic N is all we have, and our biology converts that, or if we have, you're going to talk about in the next slide, a pool of organic N that's like 80 pounds of organic N. And if you have a larger pool, you have potential to convert more nitrogen. And so that's going to be determined by that pool of N that's available.
Well, here's the data. This on the left here is a soil test pre-treatment. So this is a part of the 365 grower that I was working with. You can see there that his organic N that Sean referenced was a 89.1. That's in the pre-treated sample. So back to the soil test, right? You asked, how am I using a soil test to make a recommendation? Okay. Mm-hmm. This all started because a grower was taking soil and tissue, and he got a tissue back, and he didn't feel that his nitrogen was high enough for the yield potential or the yield that he wanted to play in. And so he sends me a message and says, hey, got my tissues back, right? Tissues typically come back before soil does because you can run a tissue report significantly quicker than what you can a soil report. So tissue comes back and he's like, my N's just not good enough. Like I got a Y drop. And I said, well, how much are you thinking about Y dropping? And he's like 60 pounds. And I said, well, did you take a soil sample? He said, yeah, I took a soil sample. I said, well, let's wait then. Let's wait and see what the soil sample says before we just go out and put another 50 or 60 pounds. So we got the soil sample back, and it said we had 288 pounds estimated to release. Total N, right? Mm-hmm. Almost 300 pounds of N estimated to release. And this is about V10.
Yeah. Okay?
89.1 is my organic N. So that pool that you talked about, we don't know whether we have a 10 organic pool of 10 pounds, whether it's 89 pounds, whether it's 130, we don't know. With a soil test, through Agronomy 365, we know that pool in this particular case is 89 pounds. So what we did is we did Y drop. I did agree to let him Y drop, but it wasn't any nitrogen. Clearly, the data shows that we had plenty of nitrogen, but we did have a fairly large pool of organic in. So what we did is we Y-dropped meltdown, and what we were doing simply with that was trying to convert that organic in pool. So we wanted to use, and I'd already had 401 in furrow, and I had not put meltdown on yet. And at this point, if you haven't seen the importance of meltdown in 401, I'm not sure either one of us can help. What we did was I wanted to use meltdown to bring that complementary effect that we see with 401, but to convert that organic in to inorganic in, or a plant available in, through the ammonification process. What you're seeing on the right there is the soil sample that was taken about 2 weeks, 3 weeks after treatment. And we had converted that from 89.1 down to 35.6. So we were actually able to convert that pool and make that available to the tune of about 54 pounds. Mm-hmm. And we were able to convert 54 pounds and release it as inorganic nitrogen. In the meantime, our nitrogen release went from 289 pounds down to 129 pounds. Mm-hmm. And again, that's because we're in that V10, 11, 12, that 1,000 GDU time frame where we've got massive amounts of uptake occurring.
Look at your biological number too. Look at your HT3 between them.
Yeah, we went from a 54 to a 74.
Yeah, so you know the biology's working. It's cranking. It's respirating. It's doing its work.
So here's the soil sample that was taken. This would have been with the first soil sample. So this is the nitrogen level that, I guess he was a little bit disappointed in. He was looking to hold a little bit higher than a 354. And the one thing about tissue testing, if you've heard me speak before, you're probably tired of it. If you haven't heard it before, as a plant gets bigger, as a plant has more biomass, your nutrient concentration goes down, right? We know that simply because that tissue test is a acid digestion that is reporting a concentration of those specific nutrient in the sample that you have. So if I have more biomass there, you look at you and you look at me and, you're an okay looking guy, but you look at myself, I have slightly larger biomass than you do.
That's right, slightly.
Slightly. And I could have a lower nitrogen reading than what you do, even though I have more pounds of nitrogen in me, because it doesn't take into account the biomass. So anytime that tissues can maintain or build while you get a bigger plant, that's a good day in our world, right? We love to see that. So this is the pre-sample. This is the post-treatment sample. There's another couple things that are interesting here. Look what our phosphorus does. I don't know if you paid attention to this because we were so keyed on nitrogen, but phosphorus is a 0.45. It actually goes up to a 0.5.
Phosphorus went up.
We actually built. Well, what have we talked about with meltdown and with 401? We kind of talk about phosphorus, don't we?
Yep.
Pretty fascinating. Look at calcium, right? We haven't talked about calcium, but look what calcium did.
Calcium goes up.
Now, why could, and this is a hypothesis, but I like to do this because it's thought-provoking and it's challenging. But we know that cations and anions form complexes, right? Mm-hmm. We know that opposites attract. I didn't marry somebody that's exactly like me because I don't want to live with somebody exactly like me. Phosphorus being an anion, calcium being a cation, calcium ditriphosphate, an insoluble bond that's not available to the plant, right? Well, I don't know, draw your own conclusions at home. Pre-sample, 0.45 phosphorus, 0.40 calcium, 0.5 phosphorus, 0.56 calcium. Again, I don't want to lead a horse to water, but draw your own conclusions. I made phosphorus available. As a result, we know that we're releasing acids or enzymes that break calcium and phosphorus away.
Did we break that bond?
Maybe we're getting a benefit that we don't necessarily talk about.
Sure. So, okay, we talked about ammonifiers. Now we talk about N2 fixers. So N2 fixers are called diazotrophs. All right. So how many N2 fixing bacteria are in 401? We've had 6. We're going to add one more in for 22. And so we've had 6 that were there. So these are bacteria that are atmospheric fixing nitrogen. They fix into gas from the atmosphere and convert it to plant available nitrogen in the soil. And so what's interesting is this new one that we're adding is going to actually be like intracellular, right? So it's going to produce nitrogen basically throughout the plant. And so we're going to have nitrogen stored at the cellular level. So That's really exciting for me, is to have a different form of a diazotroph or an N2 fixer in that system. And so we also look at 501. There are two N2 fixers in 501. And so when we use those two in conjunction with each other, we end up with the ability to have 7 plus 2 N2 fixers. This is huge.
I think the thing that you're right, it is absolutely huge. But I think a couple things need to be pointed out here. One is, that we're not going to stop and we're not going to be complacent with where we are. That's number one. If we know that there are bacteria or fungi out there that can complement what we're doing with Meltdown and 401, can bring value to our growers, we're going to put that out there. We're not going to sit here today and say, oh, we have what we have, that's all we're going to do, we're not going to do anything else, we're not looking at anything else. We're always looking to improve. And I think that we should be, right?
Right.
This one, as Sean talked about, is very interesting. Most of your N2 fixers are going to create a symbiotic relationship with the plant, and they're going to hang out there, and they're going to create that atmospheric. They're going to take the atmospheric nitrogen, turn it into an available form. And where Sean said this one is going to do that, and then it is actually going to move throughout the plant and deposit the nitrogen throughout the plant. It's a newer form of bacteria that we have not had in our blend before. We are adding it in for 2022. And maybe the most interesting thing is that Dr. Farley will not compromise. And what I mean by that is that he's not going to add one in that could potentially harm 3 or 4 or 5 others. The other thing to note is that not genetically modified, right? Non-pathogenic, naturally occurring microbes.
Now we're not putting these in there just to bolster our numbers. It's got to have a relationship, and it's got to be symbiotic with what's already there.
So here's one that it was a grower that I was fortunate to work with. He had this was 2020 data. This is in 270 plus bushel corn. He wanted to compare 401 versus a competitive biological company that is talking about nitrogen. And while we don't sit here today and say use 401, cut 10 pounds out, use 401, cut 25 pounds out. I think a lot because Sean did a great job explaining, we don't know what that total organic pool is that we're playing with. We don't know what environments, we don't know the carbon load, the available carbon that's there for 401, how successful can they be throughout the entire growing season, how much nitrogen has been applied in that system. There's a lot of things that we don't know that we're not going to sit here today and say, use this and cut out, 50 pounds, 20 pounds, 10 pounds, whatever that number is. But I thought it was interesting to take these microbes, put them head to head, and take, again, soil and tissue. I use 365 to prove and disprove products. I use them to learn about ours. Growers across the U.S., they're using them to find efficiencies. They're using them to create healthier plants, to drive that top-end yield potential. And what you're looking at is a series of weekly tissues of 401 versus a competitor, and you can see that we held a 5.3% advantage on nitrogen with 401 that equated to a 5.4 bushel advantage over the competitor. This is one that I think it's easy for Sean to align with, but this is something that I'm very big on. I really challenge our sales guys, talk about things we know, talk about things we can prove, and really what that is, and Sean put it in a much more political wording, managing expectations for realistic outcomes. The take-home message regarding diazotrophs is this: there are less N2 fixing biology due to historical fertilizer applications. And in the presence of high amounts of nitrogen, diazotrophs will grow vegetatively rather than fixing nitrogen. So what does that mean? Well, what that means to me is this. If I have a diazotroph that wants to create nitrogen, and again, remember that biology doesn't do anything that it does for anybody else other than itself, right? It does what it does because it's a function of who they are, and they do it if they have carbon and if there's a need, right? So you think about mycorrhizae, and we don't want to go down that path, but if a plant doesn't send signals for mycorrhizae, it's not going to colonize, right? So high levels of phosphorus, you struggle to get mycorrhizae colonizations. Well, what that tells me is with diazotrophs, it's the same thing. If I apply a lot of soluble nitrogen up front, right? So nitrate, plant available ammoniacal, those diazotrophs may not do. It goes back, I guess what it goes back to is that's the reason that you won't tell me that it's 20 pounds or it's 30 pounds or it's 40 pounds.
That's right. Because if you've got a lot of nitrogen up front, then the research data that we're reading says that they get kind of lazy. An N2 fixer or a diazotroph isn't really going to fix a lot of nitrogen if there's a lot of nitrogen there.
And the reason for that is that because the process is so strenuous, for lack of a better word, those diazotrophs aren't going to do what they are supposed to do because of the energy toll that it takes on their system.
Sure.
And they're not going to go through it for the sake of just going through it. If they recognize that there's high levels of nitrate or nitrogen in general there, it's not going to do what it's supposed to do. So it is like it's just going to hang out. It's just going to be there. And again, I think that that's maybe an important thing to note. You know, if you're asking yourself, well, how are these guys, right? Bodie and Sean, they're talking about biodyne, they're talking about BW. How are we different? How is our biological company? One is it's the team, it's the diversity, it's the multitude of different nutrient solubilization bacteria and fungi that we bring. We're not just focused on just nitrogen. We're not just focused on just phosphorus or just potassium, as we're learning, or sulfur or iron. We're focused on the team and the system.
All right, everybody, this is kind of the culmination, right? So we have done a bunch of these video sessions and we've covered a ton of data. I think the thing that we wanted to kind of culminate with was we've talked a lot about this Benton-Huber trial. It was a 3-year trial where they've used 401, they've used Meltdown, they've used 401 in conjunction with Meltdown, and they treat the same areas every year for 3 years. And we've talked in some of these other videos about how we really feel that the soil is changing. We are changing the biology of that soil, and when we do that, we change the structure and we change the feel and we change the nutrient release and all that sort of stuff. And so we thought we would do one last quick one here where we talk about the 3-year advantages to 401 Meltdown, because I can't stress this enough. Of anything that BW Fusion has to offer, we've got a ton of products if you look in our book. But what it really boils down to is, if you're going to take a look at us, we want you to take a look at 401 Meltdown. That is the foundation of this entire company. It's the foundation of what Bodie and I are going to hang our hat on, is what's going to help you be successful. And so we look at this, we see 2019, the first year of the trial, about an 8-9 bushel advantage. So 7.6 bushel advantage to 401 versus the non-treated. But when we add the 401 Meltdown together, we're at about 16 bushel advantage. So right out of the gate. That was the year that was wet. There was plenty of moisture that year. Now we go to 2020, if you remember from the charts we talked about on phosphorus and potassium, 2020 was the year that they were 14, 15, 16 inches behind annual rainfall. And so 401 by itself still saw a 2 bushel advantage, but when we brought those two together, about 11 bushel. And so you remember when you saw that on the potassium side, how much more potassium was available even in those drought-stricken areas. I think that is really ecstatic. And so then we go to 21, and I think parts of Iowa were fairly dry, but realistically, Iowa seems to have had a really good crop in 2021. And we saw, again, we kind of get back to that, what I would consider almost normal, what 2019 was, about a 6 bushel advantage, which is real comparable to 2019, and about a 12.5 bushel advantage to the combination of the two. And so what we've seen in this trial is we are making a bunch of more of nutrients available. And that has to be what's driving some of this. We've changed the soil, and we're making nutrients more available, and we're bringing the yield with it. And so we've talked about, a lot of what we've talked about is how yield isn't the only factor that we're looking at, right? That's an advantage, right? If we pull back some of our nutrition dollars that we don't need to spend, and we still get more bushels at the end, I call that a cherry on top.
Absolutely. And I think it also goes and answers the question of some of those folks that are asking, if I put it on 1 year, I'm not going to see a response the next year, right? And as you just pointed out, 3 years, 3 positive yield increases when we add 401, but when we add meltdown to 401, that topside bushel potential just seems significantly greater.
Yeah. And so one last trial to look at here. This is a meltdown plus 401 trial again from 2020. This was spring applied meltdown and then V3 soil samples taken. So the end result was that this was meltdown 401. It was plus 5 at the end of the year. So they added 5 bushel at the end of the year. But this
over just the 401, not a untreated.
Okay.
Over just 401.
So this is the addition of meltdown to 401, not an untreated. So that's great information. Applied to bean stubble. What I think is really interesting about this is we've talked about the indicator soil test. Well, this chart is essentially most of the values from the indicator soil test kind of brought in to compare. Zone 1 is meltdown 401. Zone 2 in the middle is the control, which was 401 only. And we see the end game of that. So again, HT3, 24-hour CO2 burst. This is our biological respiration. 55% increase in biological respiration when we add the meltdown to the 401. You take the VAST. The VAST is even a little bit better. So we are aiding in soil structure. And we've talked about this. This is something that when I say we're changing the soil, a lot of that is in the structure and the ability for roots to go find nutrients. So about a 33% change there. We see a 42% increase in nitrates, an 17% increase in ammoniacal nitrogen. The WEON, so water extractable organic nitrogen, a 10% increase. Inorganic N, we've talked a lot about this. This is the plant available nitrogen. We know this is happening. 23% increase in inorganic N by utilizing meltdown with 401 over meltdown alone. WEOC, that's another big one. It's a big.
There's your changing in your soils right there.
Yeah, that's the water extractable carbon. Okay, this is the carbon that is exchanging. This is the food source for biology. This is what's happening. 14% increase, and 28% increase in total estimated nitrogen release. So that could be organic converting to inorganic. That could be N2 fixation. That is just a change in the amount of nitrogen that is available to the plant. We haven't even talked about phosphorus and potassium yet. So H3AP, so plant available phosphorus, an increase of 27%. Plant available potassium, so the H3AK, increase of 17%. And then we touched on calcium a little bit in one of the videos, and we hadn't changed a lot, we hadn't talked about this a lot. But we see a 28% increase in calcium, and I tell you what gives this power to me, right? That I know that you did a good job when you pulled these samples. Is to look at the CEC value at the bottom. We're not changing CEC specifically with biology, but what I find interesting is that when you see a 29.9 versus a 30, that gives me confidence that when those samples were pulled, they were pulled from the very right areas because those two things would correlate.
Depth,
yeah.
Same depth.
Because if you change in different areas and your CEC is wildly different, it's no different than if you go pull grid soil samples or zone samples and you come back 2 or 4 years later to do that again. Everybody says, well, I'm going to see how my soils change. Well, if you see that and your CEC varies wildly on that sample 1 versus sample 1, then you know you're in the wrong spot. Something is amiss there. So CSC is a good indicator in this on statistical similarity, so to speak.
So to kind of put a bow on this, and this has been fun. We'll probably have to do this again.
I've enjoyed it.
I don't know if they're going to enjoy it, but I have had fun. At the core of Biodyne, we aren't about single-strain biological products. We focus on the team and the diversity. We don't focus on just one nutrient, we focus on an array. With all the noise in the marketplace and the cost of commercial fertilizer, you must ask yourself, do you want a biological product only focused on nitrogen, or one that covers nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium, sulfur? We talked about calcium, talked about boron, have seen improvements in zinc. I think that's the real question here, is when we talk about the economics, and we've hit on it, is we've shown the yield data, but we've also shown the nutrient efficiency data. And in a time where the supply chain seems broken, we don't know whether we can even get a price for nitrogen. We don't know whether we're going to get the products that we need. You know, if you're looking at a biological product that does a multitude of things versus one that is just, you know, focused on one, ask yourself, is that the best spend of my dollars? And I know for me, and again, for my farm and my operation, if I can spend $20 and have a product that helps make nitrogen and phosphorus and potassium and sulfur, zinc, calcium, and boron more efficient, more available, I know where my dollars are getting spent.
I look at it, you know, I agree with you 100%. And nitrogen is, like I said, it's kind of the holy grail. It's the one we want to talk about. I think we have a product that brings some nitrogen, but it takes looks at phosphorus, potassium, everything else, and then we bring the indicator in, and we can make that in-season nitrogen decision. If we're going to side dress, we talked about it early, how our plan was if that fits our logistics, that your particular soil is one that a side dress application kind of fits. Well, now not only can I make the determination that we should side dress, but now I can use that data to kind of determine how much to side dress, what we need to do to be most efficient with that nitrogen dollar as well.
And at the end of the day, to wrap it all up, you know, Sean started it off with people, proof, and products, and it's as true today as it was when we started BW. You know, I hope that if you're curious, reach out to Sean on Twitter. My Twitter handle is at bkitch1bodie. You can also follow us at BW Fusion. At biodyne agronomy. Sean, I'll let you give your Twitter handle.
I'm Sean, SEAN_Nettleton, Nettleton. So at Sean_Nettleton on Twitter.
And if you have any questions, feel free to check us out online, www.biodyne-usa.com or www.bw-fusion.com. Or feel free to call any one of our phone numbers, reach out to any one of our reps. Thanks again for tuning in.